Chapter 41, Last Time. Chapter text the week before the Magic finale was a little surreal to Harry. On the one hand, students were still rather frequently stopping Ron in the hallways to wish him luck in the contest. On the other, Ron hadn't had to study up at every opportunity. He, Harry, and Hermione had even been able to hang out together by the lake or in the common room, chatting and catching up on homework like they used to. It felt really good to escape the thunderstorms outside by cozying up in front of the fire in the Gryffindor common room. On Monday morning, Harry, Ron, and Hermione headed down to the Great Hall and were startled to see an argument brewing at the Slytherin table. Ginny and Luna had left their respective tables and were standing just behind a seated Bridget, facing Pansy, who was standing on the other side of the table with Zabini, Tracy, Daphne, Crabbe, and Goyle. Ginny had her wand out and was pointing it angrily at Pansy. Daphne looked like she was trying to de-escalate the situation, her brown eyes darting up at the teacher's table and back. "Oh no," murmured Hermione. The three strode over just in time to hear the tail end of the argument. "Come on, Bridget," Ginny said coolly. "Come sit with us, listen to those sorts too long, and your brain will start melting out through your ears." Bridget gave a slight smirk. Then, flashing a cold look at Pansy, she got up and followed Ginny and Luna back to the Ravenclaw table, where they had presumably been sitting. It was as they sat down that Harry, Ron, and Hermione joined them. "Bridget, are you okay?" Ron asked, his blue eyes flashing over at the Slytherin table. "I'm fine," Bridget said quietly. "Pansy was talking about the Stormer's newest article," Luna answered coolly. It claimed that a Muggle-born witch attacked a pureblood ministry employee in a fit of rage, and sputtered furiously. That's ridiculous. The prophet would have said something if... That's the problem," Luna said a little more quietly, her dreamy light blue eyes oddly solemn. "The Stormer claims the Daily Prophet is deliberately keeping it quiet, and the prophet has deliberately ignored or buried other stories before, hasn't it?" Hermione and Ron exchanged a wary look, and Harry's stomach squirmed. Luna had a point. The Daily Prophet had a bad track record when it came to being honest. Usually the paper put out good information, but there were times where it had not fact-checked its articles enough, or had simply written whatever the Ministry of Magic wanted. Ginny's brown eyes narrowed slightly as she leaned in almost protectively toward Bridget. Pansy said that it was little surprise that Muggle-borns were more violent, given that they're descended from Muggles, who are one step up from animals, she growled. Her cheeks rose red with righteous fury. "I was ready to throw a bat bogey hex at the lot of them, show them how violent I could be in response to their crap, as funny as that would have been," Bridget said, biting back a smile with difficulty. "It's a good thing Daphne stopped you." "She didn't stop me," argued Ginny. "She warned you that the teachers might see. So, clearly didn't want to get hexed, now did she? And she didn't want you to get in trouble," Bridget said matter-of-factly. She just couldn't say so, being around Pansy and her lot, so she had to help in a roundabout way. "It would have been more useful if she just told Pansy to shut her face," Ginny said stubbornly. Harry laughed. Despite herself, Bridget couldn't stop herself from grinning broadly from ear to ear, her white teeth and black eyes gleaming. "Sorry, Ginny, but we Slytherins just aren't that straightforward." Dean Thomas came over at that moment, sliding right past Harry to get to Ginny. "It's me, Harry," he said politely. He took a seat on the other side of Ginny. "There you are, I was looking for you." "What for?" asked Ginny. Her tone was unusually flat, and she seemed to not want to look Dean in the eye. Dean frowned deeply. "You left the common room early. I had some stuff to take care of. You could have waited for me. I would have gone with you. I didn't need you to accompany me to McGonagall's office." Suddenly feeling immensely uncomfortable, Harry glanced at Ron and Hermione. They both nodded in silent agreement. "See you later, Ginny," Ron said quickly, and the three swept away toward the Gryffindor table, leaving Bridget, Luna, Ginny, and Dean alone. On Wednesday, Harry and Hermione went to apparition lessons. Unfortunately, the class cost 12 galleons each, and Mr. Weasley wouldn't be paid until Thursday, so Ron had to sit out until the next one. Harry had tried to pay for Ron, but Ron had brushed him off, putting on his best smile to hide how upset he was, and left Harry and Hermione in the hallway before the class started. "There's another class next week," Ron reminded himself. "It's okay if you miss one, you can catch up." The thought of the Magic prize money rippled through his mind. His stomach squirmed in a sick, uncomfortable sort of way. Wouldn't have to skive off on stuff, would you having 5,000 extra galleons just lying around? To keep his mind off these negative thoughts, Ron decided to head down to the kitchens so he could practice. On his way down, however, he overheard voices in the hall that made him pause on the stairs. Dumbledore, S left again. Where the hell is he disappearing to when he should be at school doing his bloody job? Some of us have more on our plates than just classwork, Ramsay. It was Ramsay and Snape, and to be expected, they sounded like they were on the edge of a row. Ron peeked around the corner just enough so he could see. Ramsay and Snape, for now, had a good foot between them, with Snape turned away but still speaking over his shoulder. "Don't you start with me, Snape," growled Ramsay. "Until you actually act like a bloody teacher and teach your kids rather than pick on them, you don't have a leg to stand on, telling me that shite." Snape sneered at Ramsay. "Ah yes, teach them. And what have you taught them as of late, Ramsay? How to saute and fillet, or perhaps to bury their heads in the sand? That's a skill you've certainly gotten a lot of use out of." Ramsay took out his wand, but Snape was just as fast. In an instant, he had whirled around and pointed his wand at Ramsay's chest, just as Ramsay had pointed his wand at Snape's. "You know, things are getting worse," Snape said very softly, his black eyes incredibly cold upon Ramsay's. "You can't be so mindless to think the students don't know that as well. This is not their war," Ramsay growled back. "The Stormer has made some people wary of the Prophet, being the only one to report what happened to Wilhelm Burke," Snape hissed. "You know as well as I how much that was the first step last time. Burke provoked Ida, we all know it. Perhaps, but the only story that was put out was the Stormers. And even if the Daily Prophet puts out their own version later, it will only be seen as them quickly trying to cover their tracks." Ramsay's blue eyes narrowed, his wand lowered just slightly. "That has nothing to do with the children," he said lowly. "They need to focus on their schoolwork. Anything going on in the world outside is for the Ministry to deal with." "Ah, yes, the Ministry's been so efficient in such dealings previously," sneered Snape. "Never said they were," Ramsay shot back. "But it's still their responsibility. They are the ones who need to step up." "As they did last time?" Snape asked coolly. Ramsay's sharp blue eyes flickered. "It won't be like it was last time," he murmured. Snape's lip curled. "Wishful thinking." His cold black eyes flickered vaguely over Ramsay's shoulder in the direction of the staircase. Ron quickly ducked behind the wall to avoid Snape's gaze. Snape then lowered his wand and took a step back away from Ramsay. "Be wary, Ramsay," he said coldly. "Your belief in a just world blinds you to the way things are. I've known other men who likewise believed in a just world, and they were just as foolishly wrong as you are." With a sweep of his billowing black robes, Snape turned and strode away down the hall. Ramsay glared after him, slowly returning his wand back to the inside of his robes. Then he turned, his blue eyes running over the wall. "Come out now, whoever you are." Ron flinched. Then very slowly he stepped out, guilt stamped on his face. Ramsay blinked. "Ron, I'm sorry, Professor, I wasn't trying to listen in, really," Ron said quickly. "I was just heading down to the kitchens since I couldn't go to apparition lessons, and I heard you talking and, well, I figured you wouldn't like being interrupted." Ramsay's expression softened. "Of course," he said quietly. "I don't suppose I would have wanted to interrupt teachers while they were talking either." He paused. Then he offered Ron a smile. "I know. Why don't you stop by my office for a cup of tea? I have some time before my next class." Despite his lingering discomfort, Ron smiled. "Okay." He came down the remainder of the stairs, and the two strode down the hall side by side. When they reached the potions classroom, Ramsay led Ron past the rows of desks. On his own, large cherrywood desk were several tall jars filled with some sort of silvery white grass, as well as two bottles of orangey skin-like material that Ron recognized at once. "That's Boomslang's skin, isn't it?" Ron asked. He and Harry had had to help Hermione steal some of it from Snape's storeroom in their second year. "Ingredients for the 7th year's Polyjuice class," Ramsay explained with a nod. "I had to swing by Diagon Alley to buy the Boomslang skin, but thanks to the full moon last weekend, I was able to pick the fluxweed myself. Potions work so much better if you can get all the materials fresh." The two walked past Ramsay's desk to the door at the back, which Ramsay opened to reveal his office. The room itself looked almost like a tiny studio apartment, with an enchanted window showing off the Hogwarts grounds behind his desk, and a tiny yet fully equipped kitchen taking up the right-hand side. There was a cauldron set up next to the stove, and a set of shelves along the opposite wall full of potion ingredients and cookbooks. Ramsay shifted a picture on his desk to the side to make some more room, and once Ron was seated, he put down a plate of his mint chocolate truffles on the desk between them. Ron popped one in his mouth excitedly, reveling in the flavors. "How is it?" asked Ramsay. "As good as Harry said they were," Ron answered with a grin. Ramsay smiled proudly. With a flick of his wand, he summoned the tea kettle and poured them each a cup. Ron took a sip. When he picked up the cup, however, his eyes were drawn to the picture Ramsay had moved. The photograph was of Ramsay and two women, one a short, older woman with hair and eyes the exact same color as Ramsay's, and the other slender, chestnut-haired, and very pretty. They were all talking and laughing as they sat around a table covered in large plates of food, positioned next to a Christmas tree covered in blinking lights, as if they were celebrating the holidays. Ramsay's photogenic self also kept mutely moving his mouth, and judging by the women's reactions, the jokes he was telling were pretty awful. "Is that your family, Professor?" asked Ron. Ramsay noticed Ron's gaze and smiled, holding his cup of tea in both hands. "Yes, that's my fiancée, Tana, and my dear old mum. They look pretty nice," said Ron. Ramsay laughed. "Trust me, they're even nicer than they look." His blue eyes ran fondly over the picture for a moment. "Whenever my life's gone wrong," he said lowly, "those two have always reminded me how good things could be." Ramsay's words brought several faces, unbidden to Ron's mind: Hermione's, Harry's, Ginny's, his mum and dad's, Fred and George and Charlie and Bill, Percy. The image made Ron's heart clench angrily, and he mentally shoved it away. His anger must have shown on his face as Ramsay looked at him with some concern. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Ron said quickly. It had been really hard to think about Percy. Yeah, Ron, and he never really gotten on that well before the war, but that still hadn't hurt any less when Percy cut himself out of the family. Ron remembered how much Mrs. Weasley had cried after Percy left, and he still caught her crying about it to Mr. Weasley when they thought he and Ginny couldn't hear. She was worried about what might happen to Percy, since he was so entwined with the ministry and was refusing to contact any of his family. And Ron couldn't blame her, really. After all, she'd lost both of her brothers during the First War. It won't be like it was last time. Ramsay's words echoed back to Ron, slowly sliding his and Snape's argument back to the front of his mind. "Professor," he said slowly, "about what you said in the hall." Ramsay's blue eyes grew a little more solemn. Ron pressed on, despite a flicker of hesitation. "Is it true, then, that a Muggle-born attacked a pureblood?" Ramsay frowned deeply. After a short pause, he put his cup down with a soft clink. "Apparently so. We don't know many details, since the only printed report came from the Stormer and Scrimgeour, and the Ministry have been refusing to comment. But apparently there was some sort of an argument, and it ended in Ida Cromwell lunging at the man and beating him up badly enough that his face was covered in black bruises." Ron's blue eyes narrowed slightly. "So she was probably provoked." "Yes, or she could have been under the Imperious curse," added Ramsay with a short nod. "Even if she hadn't been, it could very well have been a personal dispute, but without anyone delving deeper, it's impossible to know." "But you think she's innocent," Ron pointed out. Ramsay leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I knew Ida at school," he said lowly. "Always was very up and down when it came to her moods. When she was sad, she was like a Dementor hovering about, and when she was happy, she was over the moon. I would not put it past her to do something reckless, but this was beyond reckless. This was dangerous. I wouldn't have thought Ida could feel the kind of rage needed to beat someone that badly." Ramsay gave a small sigh. "But even I must acknowledge that I haven't spoken to Ida since we were at school, and even then, I only knew her in passing. I can't claim any sort of deep knowledge about her character." Ron bit the inside of his lip. Ramsay leaned forward, placing his arms down on the desk. "Ron, as much as I understand the temptation to worry about this, I want you to forget about it. You have the finale to think about, after all. Don't worry about the war. There are many responsible adults around you that will ensure your safety." Ron wanted to believe Ramsay so badly, but no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't. Still, he put on his best smile and finished his cup of tea before heading back upstairs. Chapter 42. Movement on the Map. Chapter text the following morning Ron told Harry and Hermione about what Ramsay had said on their way down to breakfast. As always, Ramsay's determined to act like we should just do nothing, Harry said scornfully. I know, I just don't understand it, grumbled Ron. I mean, Ramsay's smart, and he hates when people don't put in the proper work, so how can he be so okay with just sitting back and letting the ministry handle things? And hell, he could at least give the order its fair dues. If he did, then he'd have to admit Dumbledore was right to bring the order back together, Harry said dully. Ramsay hates Dumbledore, remember? True, granted Hermione. It's like Dumbledore said, people find it far easier to forgive someone for being wrong than for being right. Professor Ramsay probably doesn't want anything to do with Dumbledore, at least when it comes to the war. But Ramsay so clearly hates the Death Eaters. It's a shame that he can't get over whatever trouble he had with Dumbledore in the past and work together with him, Ron nodded. I know, I mean, they clearly can work together. They've been judges together for a while. But when it comes to the war, Ramsay he was cut off abruptly, however, when Dean abruptly shoved past him Harry and Hermione to catch up with Ginny, who had already started up the staircase on the far end. Ginny, wait. Ginny, however, looked to be in no mood to talk. Her face was very red and her eyes were full of tears. Ron and Harry, their faces both flashing with concern, tried to chase after them. Unfortunately, Ginny was small enough that she was able to evade all three of them, and she disappeared into the crowd, leaving Dean stranded at the bottom of the stairs. When Ron, Harry, and Hermione caught up with Dean, Ron whirled on him immediately, looking furious. What did you do to my sister? He demanded. Nothing, Dean insisted. Harry noticed he looked just as upset as Ginny had been. His brown eyes were weak and almost shaky. Don't you dare give me that, Ron snarled, yanking his wand out of his robes and pointing it right at Dean's face. What did you do, Ron? A black hand reached up and snatched hold of Ron's wrist. Ron looked back to see Bridget standing beside him. Put your wand down, she said lowly. But put it down, Bridget repeated more firmly. Ron looked at Dean. The dark-skinned boy's eyes were filling with tears that he tried desperately to hide. Slowly and reluctantly, the youngest Weasley boy lowered his wand. Dean, who was still avoiding everyone's eyes, abruptly shoved past them and left up the stairs without a word. Bridget watched him go, her eyes unreadable. They broke up, she explained quietly. What? Said Harry, startled. Why? Bridget's black eyes ran over Harry's face. For a moment, Harry was almost reminded of Snape's gaze, in how it felt like Bridget was looking right through him. I don't reckon that's your business, Potter, she said coolly. What? Said Harry again, though this time more offended. Bridget, said Ron in irritation. Well, it's not, said Bridget, her tone bluntly straightforward. I don't think it's anyone's business except for Ginny and Dean's. She turned and started heading up the stairs, her patched green schoolbag flopping against her shoulder as she went. It most certainly is my business, Ron called half-heartedly after her. I'm her brother. Bridget's right, said Hermione firmly. Harry and Ron both tried to argue, but she cut them off. Ginny wouldn't want you two to butt in, and you know it. The two boys deflated visibly. As much as they hated to admit it, Ginny probably would be just as angry, if not angrier, with them if they tried to defend her honor. Hermione gave them both sympathetic looks. Come on, let's get some breakfast. No one saw Ginny or Dean for the rest of Thursday. Most agreed they were likely avoiding everyone else just as much as they were each other. A few times Ron grumbled to himself that, when he saw Dean again, he'd hex him into next week, but Hermione stepped in each time to remind him to stay out of it. Harry couldn't help but feel similarly to Ron. He kept mentally conjuring up terrible scenarios of what Ginny and Dean's argument must have been like. Some with Dean hitting Ginny, and others with the two of them yelling so loudly that their heads swelled up to ridiculous sizes in Harry's mind's eye. Clearly the argument had not been so theatrical, however, judging by how just about everyone was gossiping about Ginny and Dean's breakup, and yet no one seemed to know how it had happened or why they had done so. All anyone seemed to know was that Ginny and Bridget had been talking in the Great Hall. Dean had come up to talk to Ginny, and the argument had both been very quiet and finished within the span of a few minutes. At one point, a few Gryffindor students had tried cornering Bridget so they could interrogate her about it, but Hannah and Ernie Macmillan had both swooped down on the group within minutes and docked Gryffindor 5 points. I don't care what your reasoning was, Harassment is harassment, Ernie scolded them pompously. And if we see you do it again, we'll make it 20. Hannah nodded, her brown eyes very reproachful. Now run along. I'm sure you have classes to get to. Despite his irritation about the event, Ron had to force his concern about Ginny away for a short while. The finale was on Friday, and he needed to be ready, so he spent the rest of the day reading cookbooks and practicing in the kitchens. Fortunately, Astoria had come to the same conclusion, and she ended up being pretty good company in the library and the kitchens. She had borrowed a lot of helpful cookbooks from Arjuna and quickly decided that the best way to practice for the finale was to pretend to cook a Christmas dinner, so as to work on all of the usual dishes. They might be asked to make appetizers, entrees, sides, desserts, and even drinks. I was talking with Kevin the other day, she told Ron, as she checked on both her and Ron's pies in the oven, and he mentioned that he'd like to start a formal cooking club. That way we can still meet up and cook together, even after the contest's over. That'd be awesome, said Ron brightly, as he mixed the dough for his raisin bread. I mean, I'll have to do it around Quidditch, of course. Cho will have to as well, I suppose, Astoria said thoughtfully, as she returned to the fresh pumpkin juice she was making. And I know Owen's in the Garbstones Club, but we can negotiate the schedule so it doesn't conflict. Ron smiled. It's kind of weird, you know. To think it's almost all over. Yeah, Astoria smiled absently. Yet it feels like forever ago since we started. I mean, at the beginning of the competition, I didn't know anything about any of you, except maybe that you were Gryffindor Keeper and Cho was Ravenclaw Seeker. And now we're friends, Ron said with a grin. Astoria smiled a little more fully, her light blue eyes sparkling a little as she nodded. That evening, Ron rejoined Harry and Hermione in the Great Hall, and they enjoyed the feast together, trying not to think about how Ginny was nowhere to be seen. Several more students came up to wish Ron luck, including Cho and Hannah, who each gave Ron a big hug. I'll be waving a Ravenclaw banner tomorrow, of course, Cho said with a smile. But I know you'll do well, Ron, you always do. Ron smiled. Thanks. Cho at one point glanced at Harry, but both of them seemed to silently agree that there was nothing they wanted to say to each other, so Cho merely waved to Ron and returned to the Ravenclaw table. When the feast was over, Ron went up to bed nice and early so that he'd be well rested. Harry, on the other hand, was not sleeping well. As Ron snored, he lay awake in bed watching Ginny's dot on the Marauder's map. She'd been hanging out at the astronomy tower almost all day, and was only just now heading downstairs probably, so that she could head up the right set of stairs toward Gryffindor Tower. Harry fancied the idea of waiting down in the common room for her maybe to ask her himself if she was okay, and what had happened. Then a dot with a familiar name crossed quickly past Ginny's in the drawn hallway. Draco Malfoy. Harry straightened up in bed. Malfoy's dot was moving very fast, like he was running. Why was he running, and where to? Malfoy's dart swept across the map and down the stairs toward the dungeons. Harry relaxed visibly. The Slytherin common room was down in the dungeons. He probably was just making sure he wasn't caught out of bed after hours. Wait. Malfoy wasn't running to the Slytherin common room. To get to the Slytherin common room, you had to turn right down the stairs, Harry remembered Ron, and he had to turn right when they followed Malfoy down the hall in disguise as Crabbe and Goyle in second year. But Malfoy had gone to the left. He's heading for the kitchens, Harry realized. He was right. Malfoy was heading straight for the room marked Hogwarts Kitchens, where one other lone dart was moving. Bridget Jahim. Feeling a flash of concern, Harry reached instinctively for his invisibility cloak. As soon as he did, though, he hesitated. He'd focused so much on Malfoy earlier that year, he'd almost lost both Ron and Hermione's friendships over it, his hand clenched over his cloak. This was serious, though. Malfoy hated Muggleborns, and Bridget had had her fair share of bullying in the last month already for her ancestry. Ron would have wanted to make sure Bridget was okay if he was in Harry's position, but there was no point in waking him up. When he had to worry about the contest tomorrow, he wouldn't tell Ron, Harry decided. He'd just make sure Bridget was okay. So Harry swept his cloak on, snatched his wand off his side table, and left the dorm, barreling down toward the kitchens as fast as he could with the map in hand. Stay there, Harry thought desperately as he watched Malfoy's dart enter the kitchen slowly. Don't do anything until I get there. He dodged several ghosts as well as Filch the caretaker and dashed down the stairs to the main level as quickly as he could without letting anyone hear him. When he reached the base of the stairs, Harry checked the map. Malfoy's dart had just collided with Bridget's. Panic-stricken, Harry picked up his pace, dashing freely down the thankfully empty hallway. It felt so long that even though Harry knew he was moving quickly, every minute felt like an eternity. He swung himself around corners, hurrying toward the stairs that led to the dungeons. Bridget and Malfoy's darts were on top of each other on the map. Were they arguing? Was Malfoy threatening her? When he finally reached the stairs, Harry nearly jumped down them. He landed at the base of the stairs and ran down the hall. Finally, Harry caught sight of the portrait of the pair that led to the kitchens. He skidded to a halt, scaring some student's white cat that had been prowling behind a suit of armor. The portrait was already open, with Bridget standing just outside. To Harry's surprise and relief, however, she looked perfectly unharmed. In fact, she looked almost pleasant as she brushed some white cat fur off of her black skirt and headed back into the kitchens, the portrait swinging shut behind her. Panting heavily, Harry returned his gaze to the map. Malfoy had just arrived at the part of the hallway just outside the Slytherin common room. Did she not see him? Harry wondered to himself. Or did he just not do anything? Both options seemed highly unlikely, but despite his misgivings, Harry slowly turned and headed back upstairs. Don't worry about it, he scolded himself. Ron needs your attention, your focus. Don't worry about Malfoy and whatever stupid stuff he's up to. It's probably nothing. But Harry couldn't help it. No matter how much he bottled them up, and how much he knew he'd never tell Ron or Hermione about them, he still couldn't fully force the thoughts about Malfoy's shady behavior from his mind. Chapter 43, Round 6, Finale. Chapter text at long last, the day of the Magikarp Junior finale arrived. It was a perfectly sunny Friday, and Harry could feel the school's enthusiasm rippling through the air. When he, Ron, and Hermione left the Gryffindor common room that morning, countless people stopped them on their way down to the Great Hall, shaking Ron's hand and wishing him luck before the final round. When they reached the hall, they noticed that Luna had come to sit at the Gryffindor table, wearing her old lion hat with a new eagle topper that occasionally flapped its wings. She must not have been able to decide whether to support Ravenclaw or Ron, Harry surmised with a grin, so she chose both. Sitting next to Luna at the Gryffindor table was Neville, who couldn't stop glancing up at Luna's hat amusedly, and Ginny. The trio immediately bustled over. "Hey, Ginny," said Harry. Ginny offered him a smile, though she looked a touch pale. "Hi, Harry. Are you okay?" Ron said at once. "Did Dean do anything to you? 'Cause if he did, ow." Hermione elbowed Ron pointedly in the side, shooting him a reproachful look. Ginny frowned. "I'm just fine, thanks," she said coolly. "And Dean didn't do anything, except maybe be a pushy git, so all anyone has to do is not be one of those, and there won't be a problem." Ron winced as Ginny turned away. Despite the lack of anger or sorrow on her face, her bad mood still clung to her like a grey storm cloud. Harry recognized the body language immediately. He'd gotten like that sometimes the previous year, when he was feeling sorry for himself, and he really didn't like the look on Ginny. "Ginny," Harry started uncomfortably. Before he could finish, however, a brown, tawny owl abruptly landed on Ginny's plate. It stuck out its leg to show off a package wrapped in red wrapping paper and tied with a shiny purple bow. Ginny blinked. Then, after a second, she recovered enough to take the package off the owl's leg and read the note on top. "Who's it from?" asked Harry. "Dunno, there's no name," Ginny said with a frown, glancing at Harry out the corner of her eye confusedly before reading the note aloud. "Whenever you smile, roses burst into bloom. Keep that brave smile on. I know you'll find the right one someday." She then opened the package. Inside were a cluster of cake pops molded into the shape of red roses and tied together with a purple ribbon. "Oh, how lovely," said Hermione. "Must be a secret admirer," Luna commented dreamily. "Unless there are any thumb-kissing selpucks hiding in the rafters. Even if there were, I doubt they'd use owls," said Neville with a grin. Harry's stomach twitched uncomfortably as Ginny's brown eyes ran over the fake bouquet. Ron picked out one of the roses and sniffed it suspiciously. "Red velvet," he said lowly, and his mouth upturned in something of a mischievous smile. "Could be poison, though. As prefect, I'm afraid I'll have to confiscate the lot, you know, for security purposes, in your dreams," scoffed Ginny, giving Ron a good smack on the back of the head as Neville and Hermione laughed. Despite Ginny's words, her familiar, gorgeous smile was already winding itself back onto her face as she took the cake pop back from Ron and returned it to the box with the others. "Well, whoever sent them, they're quite pretty," she said offhandedly, her smile brightening up her face significantly. "Though it makes no sense to eat one for breakfast, I think I'll drop them off in the dorm and have one after lunch." Ginny was noticeably more chipper during the rest of breakfast. Harry was glad to see she was feeling better, though a tiny part of himself wished that it had been because of something he'd said or done, rather than the work of some secret admirer. That mean-spirited wish felt like an unpleasant thorn in Harry's side, and he forced it out of his mind as much as he could, hating himself for even thinking it. "If Ginny's happy, that's the important thing," he told himself forcefully. Fortunately, seeing Ginny's cheerful, flushed face and being reminded of a gorgeous sunrise made it easier for Harry to push his more negative thoughts away. After breakfast, Harry, Ron, and Hermione headed down to potions with Professor Ramsay. The class centered on antidotes, which were complicated even by potions standards. "To create an antidote properly," explained Ramsay, "one needs to reverse brew the recipe for the original potion, providing for the irregularities in temperature and the placement of the planets, and must counteract any and all after effects with additional ingredients. Just about nobody could get the hang of it except Hermione, who won Gryffindor 20 points for knowing what ingredients could best counteract the draft of the living death." Ramsay then placed a series of antidotes on the table at the end of class and had everyone come up and pick one to do an essay about, which would be due the following week. Harry was one of the last students to reach Ramsay's desk, and all that was left was a short bottle labeled hair-renewing potion and a cluster of reddish stones, which everyone seemed to have bypassed. It took Harry a second, but once he realized what the stones were, he picked one out, tucking it into his pocket. "Well, great," sighed Ron. "Now that the contest's almost over, I'll actually have to do Ramsay's S, and of course it's a bloody mad one. You and Harry will just have to study up," Hermione said smugly. Since the Half-Blood Prince didn't seem to be of much help this time, Harry shot Hermione a sour look. At noon, Ron bid Harry and Hermione goodbye and headed down to the dungeons to meet with Astoria and the judges, fending off more wishes of good luck as he went. After lunch, however, Professor McGonagall came by the Gryffindor table to speak to them. "Potter, Miss Granger, Miss Weasley, I'll need you to come with me, please." Harry and Ginny exchanged a surprised look. Then they and Hermione obediently rose to their feet and followed McGonagall out of the great hall. "Professor," said Harry, "is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, Potter," McGonagall said calmly, as she brusquely escorted them up the stairs. "You three are simply needed in the headmaster's office." "I asked Ginny." They stopped in front of Dumbledore's office. McGonagall glanced back at them, a ghost of a smile touching her face, before she turned back to the gargoyle guarding the doorway. "Turkish delight." The gargoyle hopped aside, and she led the three into the office. Almost as soon as they entered the room, there was a loud, joyful squeal, and suddenly a round, ginger-haired woman had leapt forward out of her seat and lunged at Harry and Hermione, wrapping her arms around both of them in a squeezing hug. "Mrs. Weasley," choked Harry. "Harry, Hermione," squealed Mrs. Weasley gleefully. "Oh, Minerva, thank you for bringing them too. Ron will be so excited. It was my pleasure," McGonagall said with a dewy smile. Ginny looked from McGonagall to her mother in surprise. "Wait, so it's not about the war, it's about Ron." Mr. Weasley nodded, smiling broadly. Professor Dumbledore asked Gryffindor and Ravenclaw's head of houses to arrange for their finalists' families to sit in a front box during the finale, so that we can support Astoria and Ron when they compete. Mrs. Weasley released Harry and Hermione, and the two shakily steadied themselves. Once they had regained their center of balance, they looked up to see Fred, George, Bill, Fleur, and Charlie were also there. Fred and George had planted themselves on top of Dumbledore's desk, their legs dangling off the edge like they were kids, while Charlie was leaning his back up against the wall and Bill was sitting in a comfy chair with Fleur in his lap. Sitting beside Dumbledore's desk, in a set of delicate white chairs, were Professor Flitwick, Daphne Greengrass, and a witch and a wizard who had to be Daphne and Astoria's parents. Daphne clearly followed more in her parents' footsteps than Astoria did, judging by their crisply tailored dress robes and their prim postures. Both of them had brown hair like their daughters, though Mr. Greengrass had unreadable brown eyes and olive skin, while Mrs. Greengrass was paler and had sharp eyes that were the same shade of blue as Astoria's. Mr. Greengrass had a neatly trimmed beard and a curled-up mustache, and Mrs. Greengrass had styled her hair in an intricate updo with about 30 pearl-encrusted hairpins. It gave them a pretentious air that reminded Harry immediately and unpleasantly of the Malfoys. But Hermione said hesitantly, glancing from Mr. Weasley to Mrs. Weasley, "But Harry and I aren't family. That space should be for you." "Nonsense, dear," Mrs. Weasley said kindly. "Why, after all the times you and Harry have visited us, all these years, you both are more than family to us." Harry couldn't keep himself from smiling. Mrs. Weasley brought a hand through his dark hair and patted his cheek fondly. "And besides," she said brightly, "I know Ron will be beyond thrilled to have you both there, cheering him on. Just imagine, my little Ronnie, about to win a contest hosted by Gordon Ramsay." Harry did not miss the unmistakable flash in both Mr. and Mrs. Greengrass's eyes in response to Mrs. Weasley's words. They did not, however, verbally respond, instead choosing to merely stew in cold silence. But Harry still felt as though the temperature in the room had suddenly dropped a few degrees. About an hour later, the Greengrasses and the Weasleys plus Harry and Hermione headed out to the Quidditch pitch. As they strolled up the field to their two front boxes, Harry flinched in response to the white flashes that rippled over them. Glancing to his right, he noticed a familiar blue-haired reporter with cat's-eye glasses scribbling on a piece of parchment while her partner, a shorter man with curly ginger hair and an overbite, snapped away with his camera. Noticing Harry's disdainful gaze toward the reporters, Ginny took hold of his arm and pulled him along after her. "Don't worry about them," she reassured him. "People like that are like mountain trolls. I reckon. Ignore them, and their tiny brains will get diverted elsewhere." Harry laughed. They settled down in the left of the two front boxes. Harry sat between Mr. Weasley and Charlie, just behind the shorter Hermione, Ginny, and Mrs. Weasley. The stands nearby were also slowly filling up with student spectators, many of whom were carrying banners. Ravenclaw's stands were a sea of blue, Astoria is our ace, banners, while red, Weasley is our king, banners had taken over Gryffindor's. Slytherin and Hufflepuff were a little more evenly split, but by and large it looked like Hufflepuff was mostly red and Slytherin was mostly blue. How many of those Slytherins are only supporting Astoria because she doesn't come from a family of blood traitors? Harry couldn't help but think scornfully. Finally, the four judges, Ramsay, Dumbledore, Slughorn, and Bagnold, strolled out onto the field. Dumbledore, Slughorn, and Bagnold had all dressed in their school colors, but Ramsay, predictable to form, was still dressed in chef-worthy white. "Welcome," proclaimed Dumbledore. "Welcome, one and all, to the grand finale of Magic F Jr." The stands roared with applause, and the reporter's camera flashed wildly. Dumbledore eased the crowd into silence by merely holding up a hand and slowly lowering it. "May I introduce our two finalists? First, we have an innovative young wizard who has time and again come up from behind to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat from Gryffindor House Ron Weasley." Everyone cheered as Ron dashed out from under the stands onto the field. He stopped in front of Dumbledore and looked up at the stands, his face spread into a huge grin. "Go, Ron," screamed Charlie, his hands cupped around his mouth like a megaphone. Ron turned, recognizing the voice, and his eyes landed on his family in the left front box. Harry immediately started singing "Weasley is our king," and Ginny, Hermione, Fred, and George quickly jumped in, singing even louder and more off-key than Harry, much to Fleur's disapproval. Ron flushed scarlet, his blue eyes shining excitedly. "Hi, Mum," he called even though he couldn't be heard over all the cheering, waving broadly at them. "Hi, Dad, you guys." Mrs. Weasley was as red as Ron, and her eyes flooded with tears as she waved back, squeezing her husband's hand in a deadly vice grip with the other. "Second," said Dumbledore, once again quieting the crowd with little effort, "we have a brilliant young witch who in every round has shown the heart needed to learn, lead, and win from Ravenclaw House Astoria Greengrass." Astoria dashed out onto the field after Ron, stopping next to him. As she turned toward the crowd, she looked less excited than Ron. but it was clear that it was more due to her dislike of the spotlight than anything else. Her blue eyes sparkled as she looked over the Ravenclaw stands, as if she was hoping to see one particular face more than any other. When she noticed her family sitting mutely in the right front box, she seemed less encouraged than Ron had been. Her smile faded momentarily at the sight of her parents, and she pointedly looked away back up at the stands. Ron took a covert sidestep closer to Astoria. "You okay?" he whispered. Astoria kept her eyes on the stands as she nodded. "Yeah, I never wanted or needed their approval anyhow," she said quietly. "If I win, then I'm getting out of their house, and nothing they say will stop me." Ron glanced over at the green grasses, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Just looking at your parents, I don't blame you. I reckon Daphne's probably itching to fly the coop too, eh?" Astoria snorted dismissively as Bagnold faced the crowd. "Today, for our final challenge, our two finalists will have to make us a formal 5-course meal, complete with their best dishes. The only rules are that each course, soup, appetizer, salad, main course, and dessert, must be filled, but other than that, any kind of food goes. You will only have 90 minutes to complete your 5-course meal," said Ramsay. "Your time starts now." It was amazing how frenzied 90 minutes could be. Astoria and Ron raced to their stations, met up with their house elf partners Poppy and Darby, and got to work, hurriedly putting together their menus for the judges. For everything that needed to be done, an hour and a half was not nearly enough time. Ron had to prepare the crusts for his miniature honey-baked ham meat pies while also mixing together a shallots vinaigrette for his roasted pepper salad, checking on his oysters bouillabaisse, and regularly stirring his potato soup on the opposite stove. Then, right in the middle of everything, Slughorn stepped forward in front of the workstations and addressed the crowd. "Halt the clock!" The giant clock that had been projected onto the stands abruptly froze, with 60 minutes remaining. Both Ron and Astoria looked up at Slughorn, who was beaming. "Every chef, when in the industry, has to deal with sudden changes," he said jovially. "So we judges have a little present for you." With a wave of his wand, he summoned 2 tall green glass bottles from the judge's table, plopping them down on the countertops at Ron and Astoria's stations. "We have bought you 2 bottles of the finest elf-made rum, shipped specially from Budapest," said Slughorn, "which you will have to incorporate in one of your 5 courses. And don't think simply putting it in a glass on the side will do," he added with a waggle of his finger when the crowd gave a shocked gasp. "We want to taste that flavor in the dish you present to us." He tucked his wand back into his robes and strolled back to the judge's table with a flourish of his hand. "As you were, clock." The clock started counting down again. Ron quickly examined the bottle, reading the label carefully. "Elf-made, pot still. What flavors go with rum?" His blue eyes fell on the unfinished treacle tart he'd been making for his dessert, and they lit up. Treacle could work. He could just modify his mother's old recipe, like he had for her cream pie. Ron immediately dumped out the treacle filling he'd been working on and started again, adding the lemon juice and zest, treacle syrup, cream, and breadcrumbs, and then slowly mixing in the rum. When he thought it looked about right, he grabbed a spoon and gave the filling a taste. It was great. With a big grin, he put the treacle tart down on the stove for a moment and returned to his miniature meat pies. "I'll have to put them in together, for them to finish around the same time," he thought. "So better catch up with these first." He hurried to finish the honey-baked ham pies while still keeping an eye on both his soup and his bouillabaisse, lining the tiny pastries up in a row on a cookie sheet. 45 minutes left," called Ramsay's voice in the distance. "Better get the tart and the pies in right now," Ron thought anxiously. "The pies will need 35 minutes to bake." He wiped his brow, which was doused with sweat. The heat in the kitchen was incredible. It was dizzying and sickening, to the extent that it could make one feel ill, but, Ron supposed, with 2 burners and the oven going simultaneously, it was little wonder that his station felt like hell itself. Ron picked up the cookie sheet with the meat pies and headed for the oven. He blinked the sweat out of his eyes as he opened the oven door and slid the cookie sheet in. "Master Weasley," said Darby suddenly. Ron had almost forgotten he was there. "Are you all right?" "Yeah," said Ron distractedly. What did he need now? Oh, right, the tart. Ron picked it up, but as soon as he bent down, he suddenly felt a bizarre burst of pain surge through his stomach. "Ulk!" Ron hunched in on himself, trying to keep himself from dropping the tart. "Master Weasley." Darby darted over, clutching Ron's arm with his knobbly hands. Master Weasley, are you all right? I feel sick. A barrage of painful, multicolored lights were attacking his eyes, blinding him. Ron fell to the ground, and he heard a clang next to him that had to belong to the treacle tart's pan. Master Weasley. The kitchen was spinning. The world was spinning. Ron couldn't see anything, no matter how hard he tried to blink the lights away. His mouth felt dry and numb. He felt his own saliva dribbling down his shirt, as if it had completely bypassed his lips. Ron! A familiar voice echoed over him, a female one, Astoria's. Ron tried to say something, but it felt like he couldn't move his mouth. Even though he knew he was opening and closing it, he didn't feel any of the muscles move. Ron! Ron! More voices started screaming his name, though Ron couldn't pick out whose they were. So hot, so cold. The tips of his fingers felt like they were on fire. His throat was burning, yet he kept shivering, unable to shake the horrible chills scraping down his spine. Someone was screaming and crying hysterically. A pair of strong, rough hands grabbed onto Ron, clutching his shoulders and trying to hold him up. Get me my bag, now. Ron couldn't feel his legs. He tried shaking them, shaking his arms, everything. They shot out in unpleasant, frenzied lashes, and with every shudder they started to numb like they were disappearing. Ron, a voice echoed, somewhere far, far away. Take this, Ron, eat it. Another hand clutched the back of Ron's head, supporting it as the other forced something down his throat. He choked, trying to dislodge it, but the hands clamped his mouth shut. Come on, Ron, swallow. He couldn't breathe. The foreign object was blocking his breath. He had to swallow the thing, just to get it out of his windpipe. All at once, the hot, cold, numbing, frenzied horror halted. Still blinded and unable to hear a thing, Ron collapsed, his mind going black. Chapter 44, Round 6, Aftermath. Chapter text: Ron was taken to St. Mungo's immediately for poisoning. Madame Pomfrey said that because he had not been treated within the first minute of ingesting the poison, it had filtered into Ron's veins, making it impossible for her to treat it on her own. The only reassurance she could give Mr. and Mrs. Weasley was that Ron could not have ingested that much. If he'd had any more than a milligram of the stuff, his body would have shown symptoms much sooner. As Ron was taken away on a stretcher with the Weasleys following behind, Dumbledore brought an arm around Harry and escorted him, Hermione, and Astoria off the field. Harry was so numb and terrified that he didn't even realize that the flashes of light flickering over his eyes belonged to the Daily Prophet reporter's camera. The three were brought up to Dumbledore's office to wait while the judges sorted everything out downstairs. Darby brought them some hot chocolate, but none of them could bring themselves to drink it. Astoria was very pale as her blue eyes drifted aimlessly around the room, unable to focus on anything. Hermione was hunched up in the armchair by the fire, clutching at her sleeves and crying quietly. Harry sat on the floor, hugging his knees tightly. If he hadn't remembered the prince's scribbled note about bezoars in the antidotes chapter of his book, and taken one from Ramsay's desk that day, Ron would have died out there on the field. What was happening to him now, at St. Mungo's? Had Harry given him the bezoar in time? Would it not be enough? Images of Ron saving goals during their last Quidditch practice, flushing from head to toe at the sight of them, offering him corned beef sandwiches on the Hogwarts Express, all flickered through his mind. He'll live, Harry reproached himself, closing his eyes fiercely to block out the flood of tears. He'll live, damn it, he'll live. Harry had no idea what he'd do if he didn't. A set of footsteps quietly entered the room. Harry abruptly opened his eyes and looked up. Dumbledore had returned. Harry, Hermione, and Astoria all shot to their feet. What happened? Harry asked at once. Is Ron? He's resting at St. Mungo's, Dumbledore said calmly. He's still unconscious, and the poison has caused some damage to his spinal cord, but the healers say that he'll be all right. Both Astoria and Harry exhaled. Hermione burst into tears of relief, covering her face with both hands. What was it, Professor? Asked Astoria urgently. What was poisoned? Why didn't? The rum we assigned you was, unbeknownst to us, laced with a deadly mix of hemlock and aconite, Dumbledore explained, judging by the broken seal around the bottles. It seems that after we purchased them and put them in storage, someone opened the bottles, added the poison, and then resealed them without anyone noticing. We found the same poison in the rum filling you were mixing at your station, Astoria. Harry glanced at Astoria out the corner of his eye. She had gone very pale. Chocolate liqueur lava cakes are one of Daphne's favorite desserts, she mumbled, looking ashamed. We've substituted rum before when there wasn't any liqueur in the house, so I didn't have to taste test it the way Ron would have had to for his. Do you know who could have done it, Professor? Asked Harry. Dumbledore peered at him solemnly over his half-moon spectacles. The house elves stored the rum in the kitchens for safe keeping, he said quietly. We questioned them about the kitchen's visitors, and they informed us that there was only one person down in the kitchens that night, Bridget Jahim. All three students looked horrified. Harry felt his stomach crumple up in his chest. No, that hadn't been the only person there that night. The Marauder's map had said so, hadn't it? He'd shoved it off, thinking that it must have been a mistake. He hadn't wanted to worry about it, because he knew no one would believe him. But no, Harry said forcefully. Everyone turned to look at him. Bridget didn't do it, he repeated firmly. She would never have hurt Ron. Astoria nodded in passionate agreement. She wouldn't have done it, Professor. It's not in her character. Dumbledore held up a hand to stop them. I agree, but despite her clear distress, I must confess that Bridget was not forthcoming in her explanation. She told us that she was merely making a present for someone, but when pressed would not name the recipient of the gift. Astoria and Harry exchanged a look of confusion. Hermione's eyes widened in realization. With her lack of cooperation. There are many who will not believe her story, Dumbledore said gravely, even though Professor Ramsay, Horace, Millicent, and I all agreed that she is not responsible. Harry was at a loss. Hermione, however, was not. She puffed out her cheeks angrily, which made her rather resemble an overconfident pufferfish. Well, damn those people then, she said forcefully. Bridget wouldn't have done it, and logically speaking, she couldn't have. How would she have even known about the rum in the first place? You decided to add it to the challenge in a closed-door meeting, right, like you did with the other rounds, and no one else knew about the surprise before it happened. Bridget couldn't have known. The level of passion in Hermione's voice surprised Harry. Dumbledore smiled. One can only hope that everyone is as astute as you, Miss Granger. Astoria looked from Hermione to up at the headmaster. But why, Professor? She whispered. Why was the rum poisoned in the first place? It couldn't have been meant for Ron. Dumbledore exhaled quietly. That, I'm afraid, we cannot know. Professor, Harry said sharply, the necklace Katie was carrying was supposed to be brought up to the school to why, but Dumbledore silenced him with a look. I will ask that all of you refrain from theories until after the culprit is caught, he said solemnly. No doubt your classmates will develop plenty of them in the meantime, but they are not worth your time or attention at present. Hermione and Harry exchanged a concerned look. Astoria's blue eyes widened in dismayed confusion, drifting from Harry to Dumbledore and back. Now then, Dumbledore said quietly, Astoria, your family is waiting outside. They wish to see you. Harry, Hermione, Molly requested you at St. Mungo's. You may use my fireplace. Astoria glanced briefly at Harry and Hermione, her mouth opening as if to say something, but the words seemed to stall on her lips. Her light blue eyes rippling sadly, she inclined her head respectfully to them before turning and leaving Dumbledore's office. What could I even say, anyway? She thought to herself. They're Ron's best friends. They'll take care of him, so there's no point in me asking them to do so. Plus, they're probably worried enough as it is. As the gargoyle leapt aside, Astoria's stomach clenched anxiously. Just as she anticipated, Mr. and Mrs. Greengrass and Daphne were waiting outside for her, their posture prim and proper as ever. When they saw her, Mr. and Mrs. Greengrass immediately stiffened like startled cats. Daphne stepped out from behind them and stopped a good foot in front of her sister. Are you all right? She asked. Her tone was much too hard to be considered caring, and her face, however pale, was unreadable. But Astoria noted how Daphne's eyes ran over her face for any sign of injury. Yes, Astoria said lowly. Ron's been sent to St. Mungo's, but the healers say he'll recover. Did the headmaster perhaps mention whether or not they've discovered the culprit? Mr. Greengrass asked. There was an unmistakable sneer in his voice at the mention of Dumbledore. Astoria's eyes narrowed. He said they hadn't yet, but they're investigating it. Mrs. Greengrass gave a low scoff. As to be expected, Dumbledore shows his incompetence in protecting the children assigned to him. It's a shame Lucius was discovered with the Death Eaters. He showed more concern for the children of Hogwarts as a school governor than Dumbledore has in his entire tenure. Hard to show concern for students when he tried to kill a handful of them at the Ministry of Magic. Astoria shot back coldly. Mrs. Greengrass whirled on her daughter, her blue eyes widening dangerously, but Mr. Greengrass stepped between them. "Mind your words there," he murmured to his wife soothingly. "Remember where we are and that Astoria's emotions are understandably temperamental, given what she just witnessed." Mr. Greengrass's brown eyes narrowed upon Astoria. She knows full well that her mother simply feared for her safety. Astoria's blue eyes flashed. If she did, she has a funny way of showing it. Daphne shot Astoria a reproachful glare around her father's arm, which Astoria ignored. "We have told you many times, Astoria, of the value of keeping your emotions contained," Mr. Greengrass said solemnly. "And in our present world, that advice has more value than ever." Astoria crossed her arms and looked away. "Astoria, you will look at me when I'm speaking to you," Mr. Greengrass said sharply, making her look up at him. His eyes were cold, but there was something flickering in the back. Was it anxiety? "This compassion you feel for lesser witches and wizards," he murmured. "You must bury it deep. Do you understand?" Astoria opened her mouth angrily, but her father cut her off by taking hold of her arm and pulling her closer. "The Dark Lord is rising," he whispered, his tone even quieter than before and betraying some concern. "There are rumors that he is trying to infiltrate the ministry. They won't publish anything about it in the Prophet, so I doubt they've reached you here, but everyone who works in the ministry is well aware of them. If the rumors are true, then anyone who sympathizes with Dumbledore and his pro-Muggle leanings could be considered an enemy." "Good," spat Astoria. "I would never want to be seen as an ally of theirs anyway." Mr. Greengrass's eyes flashed with a bizarre mix of rage and terror. His grip tightened sharply on his daughter's arm, and he shook her once. "Anthony," Mrs. Greengrass grabbed onto her husband's shoulder. The grip immediately made Mr. Greengrass's hold on Astoria slacken. Astoria stepped back very quickly, her blue eyes flaring furiously at her parents. Mr. Greengrass, clearly regretting his error at once, tried desperately to compose himself. His face grew very stony. "You will keep your political opinions to yourself, young lady. That is not a request." "I don't care if it is or isn't," Astoria shot back. "It's bad enough I have to keep my mouth shut and my head down whenever you have the Bulstrodes or the Carrows over, but you can't tell me what to do or say while I'm at school. We can and we will, or you'll be continuing your education at home," said Mr. Greengrass coldly. Astoria's eyes widened furiously. "Fine," she said icily. "Then I'm leaving." Mr. and Mrs. Greengrass reacted in something akin to horror. "Don't be ridiculous, Astoria," Mr. Greengrass said, and his tone was unusually shaky. "You cannot hope to sustain yourself in the wizarding world at just 14. "I'll find a way," Astoria snapped. "Your emotions are running away with you," Mr. Greengrass said forcefully, as if he was desperately trying to tamp her down. "You cannot seriously think." "I've been thinking about it for years," retorted Astoria. "I figured I'd just up and do it after winning the prize money, but oh well, I'm sure I can find a place before term's up." "Astoria Charna Greengrass, you will do no such thing," Mrs. Greengrass said, her temper clearly rising. "I forbid it." "Hey, I know. Why don't I move into a Muggle apartment complex?" sneered Astoria, her tone almost mocking despite her bile. "I wouldn't have to worry about you lot and your disgusting pureblood mania there, now would I?" "Shut your trap, Astoria." Everyone froze where they were. They then very slowly turned to look at Daphne. She was paler and angrier than Astoria had ever seen her. Her brown eyes were flaring like flames, and the clenched fists at her side were shaking. "Don't you get it?" she yelled. "They're worried about you, you idiot. The war's getting worse, and the Dark Lord's getting stronger, so they want you to keep your head down even while you're here so that you don't get yourself killed." Ron had to have been poisoned by a Death Eater, probably the same one who thought it was a great idea to give Katie Bell that cursed necklace. That means there's a Death Eater already near or maybe even inside the school. And if there is, that means he could know that your best friend's mother is practically a squib, or that you're taking Muggle studies, or that you're cooking in the kitchens with Muggle-borns on a daily basis. Whatever the bloody hell you think about the Death Eaters, Mother and Father care about you. Astoria tried unsuccessfully to shake off the shock at Daphne's outburst. You sure don't act like it." Daphne strode forward and seized both of Astoria's arms roughly. "This is bigger than some stupid family feud about house placement," she shouted. "You could have died, Astoria. Was I mad that you were sorted into Ravenclaw?" Of course I was. I thought for sure we'd be in Slytherin House together, and that I'd have at least one person to confide in, even though I had to hide my true face with everyone else. Of course I was bitter about the fact that you shed everything with ease, making friends and letting loose, while I had to stay stoic and perfect and gorgeous. Of course I resented that you put more value in education and academics than you did on your own family. Tears pricked at the corner of Daphne's eyes. The sight scared Astoria more than anything else had in her life. She'd never once seen her sister cry. But even with all that, I'd never want you dead, and obviously our parents wouldn't either. You idiot. Daphne shoved Astoria backward, turning away and crumpling in on herself to hide her upset face. Both Mr. and Mrs. Greengrass looked just as stunned as Astoria was. Mrs. Greengrass stepped over toward Daphne as if wanting to comfort her, but seemed to have no idea how to. Astoria stared at her older sister, speechless. Daphne had shut herself off as soon as Astoria had been sorted into Ravenclaw all these years. She'd assumed she'd only done so because of their parents, blindly following their silent condemnation of Astoria's choices. Never had she considered that she'd maybe felt jealous of Astoria, or resented that Astoria didn't have to play the part that she still had to play all the time. Fiffy. Daphne flinched at the familiar nickname. Astoria stepped forward, reaching a hand out to her sister. Fiffy, tears were streaming down her face, but unlike Daphne, Astoria didn't have the strength to hold them back. In a single move, she swept forward, bringing both of her arms around Daphne and hugging her tightly from behind. I'm sorry, she croaked. She closed her eyes as more tears slid free. I'm so sorry. I wasn't trying to choose academics over you. I just thought that you hated me, that you all hated me, just like you hate all the other blood traitors. You know, so I tried to forget you. Run away and find my own way by myself. Mr. and Mrs. Greengrass exchanged dismayed glances. Both of them had their mouths open and looked like they wanted to say something, but looked to be at a loss for words. Finally, Mr. Greengrass stepped forward, bringing a hand onto Astoria's forearm gently. We don't hate you, Astoria, he said at last. His tone was as cold and level as always, but his eyes were oddly beseeching, as if he wished beyond reason that she would believe him. Your sympathies for lesser beings may disappoint us, added Mrs. Greengrass, her sympathetic tone marred by discomfort, but we could never hate you. Daphne forcibly restrained the tears in her brown eyes as she looked from her parents to down at her little sister. Haven't you ever wondered why Father never joined the Death Eaters? She murmured. It's because of us. I figured that out, after Draco's father was sent to Azkaban. If he joined and was either caught or killed, well, where would we be? Astoria looked upon her parents, her tear-filled blue eyes confused and surprised. Mr. Greengrass smiled weakly. Admittedly, they're a touch brutish for my taste, as well, he said, though there was something like cynical humor in his tone. Far too many killing curses in their arsenal, and not enough brain cells. He brought his hand down Astoria's arm, resting it just over her elbow. Regardless of our difference in politics, Astoria, I will always choose you over anything else, he said firmly, his tone no less stoic but much less cold. However the world sees me, or whatever happens in the rest of the world, doesn't matter, as long as my family remains safe. And as much as I wish you would follow our example and solely look after yourself, with the war brewing, I must look after your well-being first. You must understand that. Astoria actually flinched, trying to suppress the shaking of her shoulders. I'm not like you, she choked. I can't just do nothing while the world burns. Mr. Greengrass's eyes ran over his daughter's face, but he seemed not to know how to respond. Instead, he merely looked down at the ground, his hand still resting on Astoria's arm. Daphne brought her arms around Astoria, resting her head on her shoulder. Then don't, she murmured. Just be safe about it. Astoria broke down in silent sobs as Daphne squeezed her tight, and Mr. Greengrass held her arm. Mrs. Greengrass never moved forward to comfort her daughter, but she brought her arms around herself, almost holding herself as she struggled to restrain her own tears. For the first time in the Greengrass family's history, they all stood alone in the hallway outside Dumbledore's office and cried together. Chapter 45, St. Mungo's. Chapter text, but Hilo Jengu, surely with the proper treatment, he will recover, yes. The damage to his spinal cord is nothing we can't repair, fortunately, but the poison still very nearly killed him, It will take both time and diligent care for his body to recover from such a trauma. How long will it take? I'm sorry, Mrs. Weasley, but I do not know. I'm afraid the only one who will be able to determine that is Ron himself. Those three voices were talking about him, Ron realized. But his brain was moving slowly. What were they talking about? Something about poison. He felt restrained. Was he tucked into bed? He tried to shift around so as to make himself more comfortable, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't summon the strength needed to move. His grunting got the attention of the voice's owners. Ron! Ronald, can you hear us? Ron slowly blinked open his eyes. The room felt very bright. Ron flinched involuntarily and squinted as he tried to acclimate to it, but slowly everything came into focus, from the sterile white walls to the lime-green curtains beside his bed to the two familiar people sitting beside him. "Mum," he mumbled. "Dad." Mrs. Weasley shrieked in a kind of grief-stricken relief, and in an instant she'd plastered herself over Ron and burst into hysterical sobs. "Oh, Ron, my Ronnie, thank Merlin." Ron was so stunned he could barely feel his mother's arms around him. His blue eyes darted around to the sterile walls, his father's more restrained tears, and the uncomfortable bed and sheets he was trapped in confusedly. He was in St. Mungo's. A man stepped forward, standing just behind Mrs. Weasley. He had to be a healer, judging by his lime-green robes. His skin was as dark, and his head was as smoothly shaved as Kingsley's, but he was younger, smaller, and more slender. His sharp-lidded eyes immediately reminded Ron of Professor McGonagall, but they were much less intimidating on such a soft, oval-shaped face, particularly when he offered a very small, gentle smile. "How are you feeling, Ron?" the healer asked. He spoke slowly in an articulate, yet calming tone that was the vocal equivalent of a leisurely walk in the park. Ron tried adjusting again, but he still couldn't seem to summon the proper strength. Was his mother really inhibiting him that much? Yet she didn't feel heavy, a bit uncomfortable, honestly, he mumbled. "What happened?" The healer's face became a little more solemn. "You unknowingly ingested a poisonous potion containing aconite and hemlock," he explained. "Fortunately, your friend Harry happened to have a bezoar on hand. Thanks to his quick thinking, you survived." "Harry," mumbled Ron. That was the voice that had been begging him to swallow something that must have been the bezoar, he realized, and the voice of the person who had been holding him up was Ramsay. He burst out in realization. The contest! He tried to bolt out of bed, but once again he couldn't move. He tried harder, trying to kick his legs, and that was when he realized he wasn't moving due to lack of strength. Ron blanched, his eyes going very wide. "My legs, I can't move my legs." "Ron," Mr. Weasley started. Ron barely heard him. He tried desperately to sit up, he had to see. I can't move." "I can't." Ron frantically tried to kick his legs, shake his arms, sit up, but it felt like nothing was there. It was like he was shouting down an empty hallway and getting no response. Panic was setting in, his eyes were filling up with tears of frustration and horror as he tried desperately to move, but nothing he did made any difference. "Ron," the healer said in a commanding, yet still tranquil voice. Ron froze. He felt like he should have been shaking in terror, looking up into the healer's kind, gentle face, but he couldn't. "Ron, the poison damaged your spinal cord," the healer said quietly, his expression very solemn. "It's put your nervous system into shock and made it shut down, paralyzing you from the neck down." "No," mumbled Ron. No. We've already lined up all of the potions required to heal that damage." The healer pressed on, trying to keep Ron calm, but also remaining frank. "But I'm afraid that your treatment will be very intensive. You will have to take daily potion dosages at allotted intervals over the course of a week. And after that, you'll have to take concentrated physical therapy classes for several weeks so as to re-establish the nerve connections that link your brain to various parts of your nervous system." Ron felt ill. It felt like everything the healer was telling him was being told down a dark hallway, echoing into his ears and rattling around painfully in his skull. Mr. Weasley sat down on the other side of his son and took his hand. Ron's stomach shriveled up at the sight of his father's fingers closing around his own. He could not feel Mr. Weasley's touch at all. "It might take some time, Ron," he said gently, "but Healer Jengu is confident that you'll recover." As much as Ron knew that his parents were comforted by this and wanted him to be as well, he really wasn't. He looked from Mr. Weasley to the healer called Jengu. "How did I get poisoned?" he asked. What was it? Who did it?" Mr. and Mrs. Weasley exchanged worried looks. Jengu looked solemnly at Mr. Weasley before returning his gaze to Ron. "The investigation is still ongoing," he admitted grimly. "There is a student suspected, but the headmaster has expressed doubts." "Who's the suspect?" demanded Ron. "That Slytherin girl," Mrs. Weasley said agitatedly. "Suppose she got the bright idea to take revenge on my son after he beat her to the finale." "What?" Ron tried to shove himself out of bed so violently that, because he couldn't move and he didn't have a wand in his hand, a flare of pent-up emotional magic exploded out of him, making a large crack bolt up through one of the white walls. "Ron!" gasped Mrs. Weasley. "Bridget would never do that," Ron roared. "How could they think in a million bloody years that she'd—" "Ron, calm down," Jengu tried to soothe him. "She was the only one in the kitchens the night before the finale," Mrs. Weasley attempted to explain, suddenly looking ashamed at her son's distress. "Then she was framed," shouted Ron. "Dumbledore can't think that he doesn't, Ron," Mr. Weasley cut him off softly. "None of the judges believe that Bridget had anything to do with it. They won't punish her." Ron breathed hard, trying to regain his composure. His face was still flushed scarlet. With a wave of his wand and a nonverbal spell, Jengu repaired the broken wall. Then he came to sit down beside Mrs. Weasley next to Ron's bed. "I'll be honest with you, Ron," he said patiently. "The road to recovery is not going to be easy. But if you want to get better, I need you to give me all the energy, focus, and optimism you can. It will take a lot of work and a lot of resilience, and I can't act like there may not be any residual damage. But I know that when everything's said and done, you'll be able to walk out of St. Mungo's on your own 2 feet." Ron looked up into the healer's sharp-lidded eyes. They seemed confident. "I'll be able to play Quidditch again, too?" he asked weakly. Jengu smiled broadly, and Ron was immediately reminded of Bridget's much more blindingly white grin. "In time, yes." Ron offered a weak smile. Jengu lightly patted his hand, which, once again, Ron couldn't feel, before getting up and turning to the door. "Now then, perhaps I should go fetch the rest of the family from the waiting room, since Ron's now conscious." "Thank you," said Mrs. Weasley tearfully. Jengu left the room. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley turned to Ron. "Ron, I'm so sorry," whispered Mrs. Weasley, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't know Bridget was your friend. I immediately assumed—" "Sake," Ron replied half-heartedly. If they hadn't become friends, would he have automatically assumed that Bridget would be the sort of person to poison someone who beat her in a contest just because she was a Slytherin? Ron wasn't sure, but the thought felt like a chill down his spine. He looked up at Mr. Weasley restlessly. "What about the contest? How am I going to finish it if I'm stuck here?" Mr. Weasley shook his head. "I'm afraid, judging by the gravity of what happened, that Professor Ramsay may decide not to reinstate the contest." "What? But, Ron, you were nearly killed," Mr. Weasley cut him off sharply. "Considering someone purposefully placed the poison in that bottle, one can only presume it was a murder attempt, though we don't know who it was meant for. Hogwarts has had its share of misfortune throughout the years, but this is serious. I would not be surprised if tomorrow morning the Daily Prophet has a full spread about it." "But the prize money," Ron said weakly. "The reservation." He looked at his mother desperately. Mrs. Weasley brought her hand gently through Ron's hair. Ron gave a slight flinch, as he'd half expected not to feel that either. "Ronnie, your life is more important to us than any prize," she mumbled, her eyes filling up with tears again. Before Ron could say anything, dissenting or otherwise, the door opened. Jengu held it ajar as a large group of people flooded into the room. Ginny, Fred, George, Charlie, Bill, Fleur, and just behind all the Marnays of red hair were two figures, one with messy black hair and glasses, and the other with big, unruly brown curls. Ginny arrived at her brother's bed first. Like Mrs. Weasley, she threw both of her arms around Ron's neck and clung on with all her strength. "Ack," choked Ron. Easy, Ginny, I can't breathe." She loosened up only slightly as she looked at him in her best attempt at reproach. "Well, don't bloody scare us like that, you dimbulb." Despite her blustering, she clearly had been worried. Her brown eyes were perfectly dry, but her face was very white, which made her freckles pop out sharply on her face. "How are you feeling?" asked Bill. "Okay, I guess," said Ron. He looked up at Harry, Both he and Hermione looked very pale, but they were both smiling in relief. Ron smiled back. "Guess I've got you to thank, Harry," he said, his blue eyes flickering with fondness. "You're a right hero, you know that. Come off it," Harry said dismissively, his cheeks flushing around his smile. "I'm just glad you're okay." Hermione came over to sit next to Ginny and Mrs. Weasley, taking Ron's hand and squeezing it tightly. Ron wished more than ever that he could feel her grip or that he could squeeze her hand back. "So when are you coming back to school?" Hermione asked hesitantly. Ron looked down. Mrs. Weasley brought a hand onto Hermione's shoulder. "I'm afraid, dear, that it might take a while." She and Mr. Weasley explained Healer Jengu's diagnosis. The rest of the family looked dismayed, but none more so than Ginny. But she choked. "But the match against Hufflepuff is in 2 weeks." She looked back at Harry anxiously. Harry looked concerned too, though less overtly, and he kept his composure as he turned to Ron. "We'll figure something out," he said firmly, his green eyes boring into Ron's even though he was also talking to Ginny. Ron knew Harry well enough to know he was putting on a brave face, but Ron took comfort in it all the same. He felt terrible enough without having to think about how he'd let the entire Gryffindor team down by being out of commission. The Weasleys, Harry, and Hermione stayed with Ron for a half-hour before Jengu requested that they leave so that Ron could get some rest before he had to take his first 3 doses of healing potions. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley said that they, Bill, and Fleur would be back in a few hours. Fred and George told Ron they'd come back in the morning bright and early before work. Charlie had to return to work in Romania, but he said he'd be back to visit that weekend. Ginny, Harry, and Hermione had to return to school, but they promised to write to Ron every day. "Hey, Harry," said Ron. "Yeah, look after Bridget, would you?" he mumbled. "Make sure she's okay, and then if anyone even tries to blame her for what happened to me, then we'll hex M black and blue," Ginny said firmly. Hermione and Harry both nodded. "Thanks," whispered Ron through a weak smile. When they and Jengu had all left the room, Ron felt as though he had suddenly been set adrift in a complete vacuum, turning over sickeningly in midair. He'd never been completely alone before in his life. When he was younger, he'd fantasized about it sometimes, thinking about how great it'd be to not have to share anything with anybody or having to sacrifice sleep, because someone was blowing things up in the room downstairs at odd hours. But now that he was completely on his own, he found that he didn't like it one bit. Chapter 46, En Rouge. Chapter text. It didn't take long for Ron to decide he hated being stuck on the 3rd floor of St. Mungo's. The rest of Ron's first day was devoted to sleeping and taking various unpleasant potions. Some of them burned his throat, while others made him feel nauseous, but all of them were painful to recover from. In the hours after Ron took any of them, the potion's effects would made him feel like he was getting punched all over, or his spine was being crumpled up like a piece of paper. The intense pain made it very hard for Ron to sleep, so Jengu had to also give Ron sleeping potions so he'd get the proper amount of rest. But even with that potion helping him sleep, Ron's dreams were fitful enough due to the pain that it wasn't pleasant. The morning after Ron's admittance to the ward, Fred and George returned as promised, but they looked noticeably irritated. They brought a whole assortment of merchandise from Weasley's Wizarding Wheezes to cheer their brother up, including wildfire whiz-bangs and noisemakers. But the healers had forbidden almost all of it, as they were concerned that it would disrupt the other people in the ward. Still, they were able to pin up a whole bunch of enchanted banners around Ron's bed, and he found at least a little entertainment in watching crowns, broomsticks, and the words, "Weasley is our king," fly across the orange and red streamers over his head. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley arrived an hour after Fred and George had left for work. They had brought a birthday cake, but it had undergone an hour's worth of tests before it could be let through. After feeding him a slice of cake, Mrs. Weasley tended to Ron diligently, fluffing his pillows and adjusting his blankets, but Ron noticed early on how pale and quiet Mr. Weasley looked. He didn't speak at all while Mrs. Weasley distracted Ron with talk of Ramsay visiting the family the previous night, and his focus kept drifting over to the fake window on the other side of Ron's bed, which was enchanted to show a cheerful blue sky with puffy white clouds. "Dad," Ron said at last, "are you okay?" Mr. Weasley was startled out of his thoughts. He looked at Ron and then at Mrs. Weasley, whose expression had turned almost reproachful. Mr. Weasley put forward his best smile. "Oh yes, Ron, I'm fine." Ron didn't believe him. With a frown, he glanced from one parent to the other. "Did the prophet say anything about the contest?" "There was an article this morning, yes," Mr. Weasley admitted. His eyes were still on his wife's face, though it mostly just said what we already know. Mrs. Weasley brought a hand through Ron's bangs gently. "Some reporter tried to get in here for an interview," she said brusquely. "It's just fortunate Healer Jengu was able to put her in her place before we got here, or else I would have given that woman a piece of my mind." From what Ron gathered, Jengu had been very preoccupied with protecting Ron from the press. At one point, Ron overheard two of the assistant healers gossiping in the hallway outside about how Jengu had shut the door on one reporter's hand when he tried to shove himself inside the ward while Ron was sleeping. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the press that was being kept out. Although Harry, Hermione, and Ginny had promised to write every day, Ron didn't get any letters from them the first 3 days. They hadn't even sent a birthday card. He'd expressed his concerns to Jengu. The healer's expression turned incredibly guilty. "I suppose that be because of the new security measures," he said lowly. "Out of concern for our patients' safety, St. Mungo's president Augusta Feverfew decided 3 days ago to appoint a new security team to examine all packages and letters coming in and out of St. Mungo's for potential threats." Ron's stomach dropped. 3 days, you mean, when I arrived? She appointed more security because of me. "Not because of you," Jengu said bracingly. "Remember last year, there was the potted devil's snare that was smuggled into St. Mungo's, and admittedly, these security measures were already enacted in other wizarding facilities like the Ministry and the Leaky Cauldron earlier this year." Ron's critical gaze made the healer trail off uncomfortably. "And your poisoning may have been a factor in Feverfew reconsidering the issue." "Yes," he finally acknowledged as a mutter. Ron felt his whole face flushing in shame and upset. Jengu offered a faintly strained, pleasant smile. "Tell you what, I'll send a special request to the security team to inform me whenever a letter or package for you has arrived, and when we can expect it to reach you. That way, at the very least, you'll have something to look forward to." Jengu seemed to know his suggestion wasn't much. Still, figuring it was the best he could do given the cruddy circumstances, Ron forced a small smile in return. "Okay." The following day, Ron finally received Harry's first letter. The envelope had been ripped open unceremoniously, and there was a distinct smell of stale socks emanating off of it. "It seems your friend wrote something that the security team wanted to record," Jengu murmured grimly as he slid the folded letter out of the torn envelope. Ron looked up in confusion. "Record, you mean, like they copied it?" Jengu nodded as he took a seat at Ron's bedside. "They soaked it in a replicating potion that smell reeks long after its use." Although he kept his face placid, his posture was a bit stiffer, and his voice was a touch cooler than usual in his response. With a glance over his shoulder at the other two patients in the ward, who were both distracted by their visiting relatives, Jengu then turned to Ron with a more serious expression. "Ron," he said very quietly, "you must signal to your friends to mind what they say." Ministry has become very frightened of what people are saying to each other, enough that they are monitoring every word. Ron was reminded of Umbridge watching the Owl Post and Flu Network the previous year, in the hopes of digging up dirt on Dumbledore or finding out Sirius's location. But Ron stammered. "Why? We're not with the Death Eaters. Harry would never be with the Death Eaters." "Of course not," Jengu murmured. "But unfortunately Scrimgeour has more rivals than just the Death Eaters. And right now, he's having some difficulty discerning who is a threat and who isn't." Stan Schirmpike's arrest rippled through Ron's mind, and he clenched his teeth, his blue eyes drifting down to his sheets. Jengu unfolded the letter and began to read it out loud for Ron. "March 1st, 1997, dear Ron, happy birthday. I wish you were here with us for it, so we could celebrate properly. But your birthday presents are on the way and will hopefully be there by tomorrow. I know it's only been 1 day since we saw you, but Hermione and I both really miss you. Hogwarts is just not as much fun without you here. The Daily Prophet published their article about the finale this morning. It's rubbish, as to be expected. Not only did it take up the entire front page and 2 inside pages, but it also tried to spin the thing as an act of terrorism against the next generation of upcoming witches and wizards. and blamed everyone from Ramsay to Dumbledore to Scrimgeour for not putting more security measures in place to protect us. It even tried to say that Fudge should never have removed the High Inquisitor position, as if there'd been one. He or she could have done something to prevent what happened. Clearly, they've forgotten that the last High Inquisitor was Dolores Umbridge, and she never lifted a finger to protect anyone. The reporter also claimed that she tried to interview you, but the healers prevented her from entering the ward. I'm glad for that, at least. Terence Goodfellow published a new article in the Prophet today, too, even if the editor squeezed it into a tiny corner to make room for the Magic F story. I think it was written before the finale, since it didn't talk about the contest. But Goodfellow asked your dad for his opinion regarding a new bill proposal in the Wisengamot that would relax the statute of secrecy. This guy called En Rouge thinks that Muggle-born witches and wizards should be allowed to tell their Muggle friends and family members who aren't included in the statute's exceptions, like godparents and spouses who haven't given birth to magical children, so that they can better protect them from Voldemort and the Death Eaters. Most of the Wisengamot seem to really not like the idea, but your dad put in a nice word for En Rouge. He didn't seem to agree with En Rouge's idea, but he said his heart was in the right place. Hermione thinks that the Wisengamot's probably scared about the idea of revealing the wizarding world to Muggles, but I don't know. I think En Rouge might have a point. If Sirius hadn't been a wizard, I'd really want him to know about Voldemort and me so he could have stayed safe. Bridget's all right. The rumors have already started milling around school about her having been in the kitchens that night, but it seems like they're not bothering her too much. Bridget told us that as long as you know she would never hurt you, which we reassured her was true, she didn't care if the whole world thought she did. I don't really get why she isn't more concerned about it, though Pansy and her crew said something about the Stormer having more details in their report than the Prophet did, though we haven't yet found out what she meant. Whatever those details are, though, I can't help but feel like there'll be trouble, whether they're true or not. Cormac McLagan came up to me as soon as Charms was over and asked me about the keeper position. Since he was second best at tryouts, I had to bring him on board as your substitute, but I still don't like him. Hermione doesn't either. She says that he's an absolute bore with no respect or sense of personal boundaries. Dumbledore and I have another meeting scheduled this month, just before the match against Hufflepuff. He says there are some details he wants to share with me that might help us with that project we're working on. Won't be able to write about it, of course, but hopefully we'll be able to convince Dumbledore to let us visit you on the weekend sometimes, and we can tell you about it then. A lot of people have come up to us saying they're sending you flowers and cards. Bridget sent a package off already too, though she didn't tell us what it was. As for us, Hermione says she'll write our letter tomorrow after we get done with Defense Against the Dark Arts. Write back whenever you can. Harry Ron couldn't hold back the small, warm smile that spread across his face as he listened to his friend's words being read aloud. It was like he could imagine Harry in the room with him at that very moment. Jengu likewise smiled down at Ron. "That's some friend you've got there." "Yeah," mumbled Ron, his face flushed with pride. Jengu glanced down at the letter, the smile slowly fading from his face. Then, folding it up again, he slipped both it and the envelope under Ron's mattress. "Best not to let anyone else read that," he said under his breath. Ron felt a pang of admiration for Jengu. It seemed that despite his pleasant exterior, he also had some real grit underneath, and he clearly had a good moral compass. "What do you reckon the security team was interested in?" Ron asked lowly. He had a few ideas, but he wanted Jengu's opinion. Jengu glanced briefly over his shoulder at his other patients, verifying they were both still preoccupied with their families before responding. "The sympathy for En Rouge's position, I suppose. I'm sure you know as well as I do how controversial such a proposal is." Ron nodded. Mr. Weasley had always been enamored with Muggles, but he'd well instructed his children about the statute of secrecy and how important it was to mind it. After all, as much as Mr. Weasley believed Muggles were by and large good, just as witches and wizards were, he also knew that uprooting their entire worldview could be very traumatizing and could lead to severe consequences. Hence, why the Ministry had to employ so many obliviators to erase or modify Muggles, memories when they witnessed the use of magic. It's Well, it's not entirely right, maybe, Ron said slowly, but I don't think Scrimgeour should be afraid of something like that. I mean, he's fighting the Death Eaters. That's much more of a threat than some guy trying to open up the laws so people can protect their loved ones. You're right, Jengu said softly. It is much less important. He folded his arms over his chest. En Rouge, and the people who agree with him, believe that the draconian split enforced between the wizarding and muggle worlds is why the Death Eaters have been able to sway so many witches and wizards to their side in both wars. It is ignorance, bred from lack of knowledge about muggles, their culture, and the amazing technology they've produced in place of magic, that breeds the prejudice, fear, and hatred that the Death Eaters use to turn sane people into monsters. Therefore the thought is that if we tear down the wall between our two worlds, then we can come together and create a new one of peace, harmony, and mutual respect. Ran wanted to like what Jengu was describing, but something in him made him give pause. But that wall between the worlds does more than just separate us, he said slowly. It protects us too. I mean, when muggles did know about witches and wizards, they tried to hunt us down and burn us at the stake. Muggles are more reasonable than they were in the past, Jengu pointed out. Some are, Ran argued. Harry's relatives, the Dursleys, flickered over his brain. But some aren't. And even if they are the reasonable sort, it still would be an awful lot for them to swallow, learning that there's a whole secret world that they never knew about, and that could have rewritten their memories or lives without their knowledge or consent. Wouldn't it be better for us all to tell the truth, rather than hide away? Asked Jengu. Sure, Ron said uncomfortably, but I still don't know if we should tell everyone. Telling family, that makes sense, but not everyone can be trusted. And even if we tell the muggles we exist, I don't think that would make the Death Eaters go away. I think they'd still be there. Who knows, those blood purist types, they might even feel bolder knowing that they don't have to hide anymore. They might decide to openly flaunt their superiority over muggles, because it's suddenly perfectly okay to show off who you are. Jengu took in Ran's argument patiently. Rather than argue the point, he merely smiled. I suppose one's opinion of future events can only be proven when that future comes true, he said levelly. Ran frowned slightly as Jengu got up. Noticing his expression, Jengu's expression softened. Don't worry, Ran. I'm not upset that you don't agree. Difference of opinion is something to be celebrated. After all, if two people aim to do good in the world, a difference in opinion can open their eyes to possibilities they never saw before. He then leaned in slightly, his tone growing a little quieter again. I just hope you will keep what I've said in confidence, just as I will keep the contents of your letters completely to myself. His words could have sounded like a threat, but Jengu kept his tone deliberately calm and non-threatening. He wasn't holding it over Ran's head, simply reminding Ran that he was already doing him a favor. Okay, said Ran. Jengu patted him on the shoulder before turning and heading for the door. I'll be back with your potions in an hour. Try to rest until then. Chapter 47, in a roundabout way. Chapter text: Hogwarts was dreary. Ran's poisoning had left a metaphorical cloud over the student body, so much so that when the physical rain clouds arrived 2 days later, it felt like the weather was sympathizing with their emotional state. Harry's gloom started instantly every time he woke up in the morning. Even 3 days after Ran's arrival at St. Mungo's, he still found himself moving over to Ran's bunk as if to go wake him up too, only to remember that he wasn't there and force himself to get showered and dressed. Then he'd meet up with Hermione and Ginny in the common room and head downstairs for breakfast. Still no word from Ron, asked Ginny. No, said Harry. Hermione looked concerned. Do you think he's gotten everything we sent? No, he can't write letters himself, but I would have thought he'd have sent something back by now. Maybe he's just being kept busy with getting better, offered Ginny, though she didn't look too sure. I mean, there'd be no reason for St. Mungo's to censor his mail, right? She glanced at Harry, but he looked just as unsure as she did. After all, Umbridge had certainly convinced the Ministry to let her read all of Harry's incoming and outgoing mail, even though it wasn't the least bit legal or justifiable. That particular morning, the great hall was buzzing like an upset hive of bees. Many of them were muttering amongst themselves, looking angry or conspiratorial, Harry also noticed people holding onto a weird paper with red writing that he didn't recognize. "That's the Stormer," said Ginny, her eyes narrowing sharply. She and Harry immediately started looking around, having both thought to look for Bridget, but she didn't seem to have arrived yet. "Ginny, intercept Bridget before she gets here," Harry muttered to her. "Hermione and I will figure out what's going on." Ginny nodded in agreement, her brown eyes flashing at the tables before quickly turning and dashing out of the hall. Harry and Hermione exchanged a concerned glance before starting their methodical trek to the Gryffindor table. They found Neville sitting with Lavender, Parvati, Dean, and Seamus. All five of them looked anxious and angry. "Neville," started Harry, but Neville didn't even need for him to ask what was going on. "Someone smuggled in copies of the Stormer's Magic report," he explained, his eyebrows knitting together angrily. "It repeats that rumor everyone's been spreading, about Bridget in the kitchen, and also puts forward this bogus theory that she targeted Ron and Astoria for poisoning because of their ancestry." Both Harry and Hermione's mouths dropped open in disgust and shock. "What?" Parvati nodded, looking furious too. Cuff's trying to claim that Bridget was jealous of their talent and heritage, and so decided to take her feelings of inferiority out on Ron. "I mean, I don't know Bridget all that well, but even I know she's got plenty of talent. And she got a scholarship from Ramsay. She's got no reason to be jealous of Ron." "Well, it's obvious why he wrote it that way, isn't it?" Seamus spat in disgust, his clenched fists on the table shaking with rage. "That Garmin Cuff wants to turn this whole thing into a story of the poor, maligned purebloods being under attack by the mean old Muggle-borns, now doesn't he?" "Bloody poxbottle." Dean rested a hand on Seamus's shoulder, squeezing it lightly in an attempt to calm him, even though he looked just as angry himself. "Some people have been suggesting that Bridget should be suspended until everything's sorted out," he said lowly. "Others already seem to think that there's enough evidence already, and she should be expelled and maybe even arrested." Hermione's cheeks flushed angrily. "That's rubbish. All anyone knows is that Bridget was down in the kitchens that night, not that she had any contact with the poison. For all anyone knows, the bottles were already poisoned by the time she got there, or maybe they were poisoned after she left." To Harry's surprise, Lavender jumped in to agree. "Right, and besides, Ron's friends with Bridget. It'd be like guessing Hermione or Harry poisoned Ron. It's just not something they would do." Dean turned to Harry and Hermione. "Did you hear anything about why Bridget was down there that night? If she told everyone what she was doing, maybe she'd have some sort of an alibi." "She said she was cooking for a friend," said Harry. "Though she didn't say who." Dean and Seamus exchanged a wary look. "Clearly she didn't want that person to get any scrutiny," Hermione interjected, her voice almost overly firm. "Maybe it was a Slytherin student whose family wouldn't have wanted her spending time with a Muggle-born. Imagine how much that would get blown up at this school, let alone at the Stormer." "True," said Neville. "And let's be honest, the Stormer would have suspected Bridget even if she had an alibi. Cuff and his lot don't trust anything Muggle, and that includes people from Muggle families. They'll spew any story that fits into their gross propaganda." Harry looked down at the table, his green eyes narrowing in thought. "Neville's right. Nothing Bridget says will help, as far as those people are concerned. The only way to prove her innocence is to catch the person responsible, the real culprit." The memory of Malfoy's dot on the Marauder's map rippled through his mind again. "You don't have any proof," he reminded himself. "Hermione won't believe you. Ron's stuck in St. Mungo's, and even Dumbledore told you not to try to theorize what had happened." Harry glanced around at the others, nodding his head as the other discussed the Stormer and Bridget, but barely hearing them. "If Malfoy's responsible for Ron's poisoning, then I'll just have to prove it myself. Then Bridget can't be suspected anymore." Meanwhile, Ginny reached the stairs that led to the hallway that she knew held the Slytherin common room. Not knowing exactly where the common room was, she decided to wait at the base of the staircase. The hallway was quiet and mostly abandoned, though she exchanged nasty looks with one group of fifth-year Slytherin boys as they passed. After a few minutes, a familiar figure with a green and silver tie, black robes, and intricate braids came around the corner. "Bridget!" Ginny dashed up to her, and in a sweeping gesture, she'd looped an arm around Bridget's and yanked her up the stairs. "Ginny," said Bridget, startled. "What's going on?" Ginny led her in a quieter, roundabout way to the great hall so they could talk privately. She told her about what she'd seen in the hall and presumably what everyone had to be chattering about. "I reckon we should wait until the hall's cleared out before heading up there," said Ginny. "Then you can eat in peace." Bridget raised an eyebrow, a soft smirk on her lips. "A little odd to see you so cautious." "This isn't about caution," Ginny muttered sourly. "It's about making sure that people don't jump you as soon as you arrive in the Great Hall." Bridget's smirk faded from her face. She stopped dead in her tracks, making Ginny abruptly come to a halt next to her. "Ginny," she murmured solemnly, "you don't have to worry about me. I can take care of myself." Ginny turned to her, her eyes narrowing reproachfully. "Bridget, you've already been picked on more than once thanks to the crap Uric Cuffs published. If this report says what I think it might, you might have to deal with more than just taunts or threats." "Maybe," said Bridget, "but I can still handle it." Ginny opened her mouth to argue, but Bridget ploughed on. "Ginny, I know you and your brother and your friends have it in your heads to protect me from all this, but you can't always be there. And to be honest, you shouldn't be. I need to take on this burden myself, if I have any hope of overcoming it." "Whatever you might have in your head, we're not going to just leave you to the wolves," Ginny said stubbornly, "and you can't change our minds on that." Bridget's expression softened slightly. "I know," she said, "and believe me, that means a lot. But I don't want you to think you have to selflessly throw yourselves in front of me in some noble effort to protect me from what people might think." "You mean the way you did?" challenged Ginny. Bridget raised her eyebrows innocently. Ginny's confident expression didn't shift. "I know you made those cake pops, the ones that looked like roses. That's what you were making the night before the finale. You just didn't want to tell anyone, because then everyone in school would be gossiping about me, even though it meant everyone would think you were some sort of villain." Ginny crossed her arms disapprovingly. "You somehow thought it was more important to protect my reputation." Bridget grinned. "Oh, no, not your reputation, just you." Ginny frowned in confusion. "Everyone had already been gossiping like crazy about you and Dean breaking up," said Bridget. "And when Ron got poisoned, well, I knew you'd be worrying about him, even more than I was. If I told the judges that you were the person I was cooking for, then they would have had to question you while you were waiting at St. Mungo's. And sooner or later the rumors would swirl around here at school, and I just figured you had more than enough to worry about already." Ginny's disapproval cleared, leaving her face a little more pensive. "Well, I don't care if everyone knows," she said offhandedly. "You want people questioning whether or not you date a girl?" Bridget asked, raising an eyebrow. Ginny shrugged. "Doesn't matter to me." Bridget smiled wryly, her white teeth gleaming. She started to walk slowly up the hall again, and once Ginny had started to follow, the two both sped up a little, striding together side by side. "I admit I didn't think you'd take it so well," said Bridget lightly. "Why? Most girls don't." "Well, I'm not like most girls," Ginny said coolly. Her face then grew a little more serious. "Bridget, even if I don't care what people think about me, or if anyone knows you baked those cake pops for me, I have to be honest that I don't really want to date me," Bridget finished, though her voice was remarkably casual. "I figured as much." "No," Ginny said at once, her face becoming oddly ashamed. "I just don't really feel like dating anyone right now, honestly. Because I realized something when I broke up with Dean. No matter who I've dated or how nice that person's been, I always catch myself dreaming of being somewhere else, with someone else, thinking of how he'd treat me like a friend, like a comrade, like an equal, rather than just someone to shield or hold on his arm. No matter how good they are to me, and no matter how wrong I know I am to act that way, I still feel like it's not enough. Because they're not, Potter." Ginny looked up, startled. Bridget laughed. "Oh, come on, you think I wouldn't be able to tell," she said good-naturedly. "The way you two look at each other, it feels like you've got a million inside jokes just between the two of you." Ginny immediately looked guilty, but Bridget rested a hand on her shoulder, her black eyes gentle. "Ginny, it's okay. I made you those cake pops because you're cute, and I knew you were going through a hard time, that's all. And frankly, judging by how Potter reacted to your breakup with Dean, I reckon if he does ever ask you out, you probably won't be disappointed." Ginny gave a quiet laugh. "Thanks, but I don't think he will. It'd probably be weird for him to ask out his best friend's sister, even if he wanted to." "Well, if he doesn't, it's his loss," said Bridget with a grin. "And if you change your mind on dating anyone else, consider sending me a time and place, okay?" Ginny smiled broadly. "Okay." They finally arrived in the Great Hall. Ginny pointedly moved a little closer to Bridget as they walked through the crowd of people leaving through the double doors. Many of them started muttering amongst themselves at the sight of them. That's her sister. Poison her too. Ginny's brown eyes flashed menacingly at them, but Bridget squeezed her forearm lightly without looking at her, silently telling her not to confront them. Keeping her head high and her posture strong, she walked into the great hall without a word. At the sight of Bridget, the students still sitting at the house tables all hushed, turning to gawk at her. Bridget looked around at the 4 house tables, her expression rather measured. Then with a glance at Ginny, she strode over to her usual place at the Slytherin table. When she tried to sit down, however, Crabbe and Goyle stepped between her and the bench, their arms crossed over their boulder-like chests. "We don't want you here, Magic Snatcher," sneered Crabbe. Despite her confusion at the unfamiliar word, Bridget feigned politeness. "Beg pardon. You heard him." Pansy Parkinson strode over, Blaise Zabini, Tracy Davis, and Daphne Greengrass just behind her. Her pug-like face was even more ugly than usual, with her crinkled-up brown eyes flaring with nothing short of hatred. "Go sit somewhere else," Pansy ordered her coldly. "We don't want you here." Seeing the trouble, Ginny quickly caught up with her friend. "Bridget's a Slytherin," the youngest Weasley snapped. "She's entitled to sit at the table just as much as you lot are, probably more, given that she's got more decency than the lot of you put together." "This is an internal affair, Weasley, and it's none of your business," retorted Pansy. 5 points from Gryffindor, and I'll make it 20 if you don't clear out." "I don't think so." Hannah Abbott, who'd been sitting close by, had arrived, coming to stand on Bridget's other side. Just behind her were Neville, Harry, and Hermione. 5 points to Gryffindor for contesting unjust authority," Hannah said calmly, "and 5 points from Slytherin for misusing prefect powers. Now I do believe that seat belongs to Bridget, so you two," she shot Crabbe and Goyle a reproachful look, "should step aside." To the surprise of everyone, a handful of Slytherins sitting around Pansy immediately started yelling in disapproval. "As if tried to kill Magic Snatcher. We don't want her here." The Slytherins who were yelling only made up about a fourth of the table, but everyone else remained so stone-faced and quiet that it might as well have been the entire house. Millicent Bulstrode, who was sitting about a foot away, kept her gaze on her plate and stayed silent, even though her fists were clenched so tightly around her knife and fork that it was a wonder she hadn't bent them in half. Hannah looked horrified by the reaction. Pansy sneered at her. "Just because you're a prefect, Abbott, doesn't mean you can tell my house what to do," she said smugly. "We don't want that magic-snatching trollop sitting with us, and there's nothing you can do about it." Daphne, who'd been standing behind Pansy, glanced from Hannah to Bridget, her face unreadable but very white. His eyes rippling with righteous anger, Neville came up to stand next to Hannah. "Yes, there is," he shot back fiercely. He turned to Bridget. "Come on, Bridget, you can come sit with us." "No." Bridget stepped forward away from the others and faced Pansy with icy cold black eyes. The effect was intimidating enough that even Blaise Zabini gave a faint tremble, though he covered it up quickly. "I'm sitting with my house," Bridget said resolutely. She moved to walk around Crabbe and Goyle, but they blocked her. She moved the other way, only to be stopped again. She feigned one way, but was blocked yet again when she tried to go the opposite way. "Bridget," started Hannah. "No," said Bridget firmly. Completely undeterred by Crabbe and Goyle's obstruction, she stepped to the left, feigned right, and then continued to the left, grabbing hold of Crabbe's shoulder. In an instant, she'd hoisted herself up, bounding off the bench beside Crabbe onto the table, and stepping expertly around the plates on her toes, finally landed on the far end of the opposite bench by the wall with a flump. The observing Gryffindors and Hufflepuff all burst into applause. Pansy flushed with anger, and the other Slytherins sitting around Pansy started yelling again. Zabini even took out his wand threateningly, as if prepared to force Bridget to move, but who would stop him but Daphne, who shot out her arm and seized his wrist. "Mind your temper, Blaise," she said in a cool, level tone that could have put her father to shame. "Remember where we are and the many teachers who might see." Daphne indicated the table at the back of the hall with a quick, pointed glance. "We wouldn't want to cause a scene now, would we?" Her hand clenched around his wrist, her sharp nails digging sharply into his skin, and with a high-pitched yelp, Zabini withdrew his arm, clutching it in pain. Daphne then turned to Hannah and the others, her cold brown eyes narrowed. Although we might accept Jahim in the meantime, we will never accept you lot sitting here, she said icily. So clear out before things get really nasty. Hannah and Daphne locked eyes, staring each other down for a minute. Then Hannah nodded curtly, turning away and striding back up toward the Hufflepuff table. Daphne then shifted her gaze to Harry. Jahim's awfully lucky that her victim's friends are so quick to defend her, she said coolly. Tell me, what color envelope should I use for Weasley's get-well card? Red, or perhaps blue? Crabbe and Goyle chortled stupidly. Ginny plunged her hand into her robes, ready to hex Daphne into next Tuesday, but Harry caught sight of Bridget suddenly mouthing no at them and abruptly grabbed Ginny's arm. Ignoring Ginny's affronted gaze, Harry looked from Bridget to up at Daphne, whose face was still unusually pale. She warned you that the teachers might see. So, clearly didn't want to get hexed, now did she? And she didn't want you to get in trouble. She just couldn't say so, being around Pansy and her lot, so she had to help in a roundabout way. Help in a roundabout way? Was that what Daphne was doing? Harry put on his best smirk. Orange, I reckon, is more Ron's color. I'm sure he'll be flattered to know that you would deign to send a blood traitor like him your best wishes. Who knows, he might even send a thank-you card to your parents. Bridget grinned at Harry over Pansy's shoulder, sending him a covert thumbs up. Daphne flashed Harry a nasty glare, before turning her back with a scoff and returning to her place at the Slytherin table. With a significant look at the others, Harry headed back toward the Gryffindor table, and they followed along behind him. Harry, Hermione said with a thoughtful frown, just now you with Daphne. I think I got her message, yeah, said Harry. She wanted to know what Ron's favorite color was, I guess for a gift she plans to send him. Neville looked confused. Wait, so that insult just now was her helping in a roundabout way, Harry finished, smiling at Ginny. Ginny's brown eyes widened. Slytherins just aren't that straightforward, she recalled, as her mouth spread into a broad smile. Chapter 48. The Guild of Griffins. Chapter text. Kevin had done his best to tune out the arrival of the Stormers Magic-F report. When people had started discussing it at the Hufflepuff table at breakfast, he quickly put on his best smile and coaxed his friends, Brendan and Katsuji, to head to Professor Flitwick's classroom early so they could practice before their test on the summoning charm. He didn't want to let on how much the article bothered him, and given that Katsuji was Muggle-born, Kevin didn't want to put him in a position where he'd be forced to listen to the Stormer's bogus theories. After charms, Kevin and Brendan headed outside for care of magical creatures, while Katsuji went to arithmancy. When they met up again in the Great Hall for lunch, Kevin and Brendan were surprised to see Katsuji reading a copy of the scarlet-lettered Stormer report. Brendan immediately strode up and snatched the paper right out of Katsuji's hand. What the bloody hell are you doing, reading that bunk? He demanded, sounding almost accusing through his concern. Katsuji tried to snatch it back, but Brendan held it out of his reach. If we want to know what we're arguing against, we have to read what the other side is saying. Katsuji shot back sharply as he tried and failed once again to grab it. What they're saying is trash, pure and simple, Brendan scoffed. No point in arguing with it. There is if reasonable people are falling for it, which they are, Katsuji said plainly. Sure, you can't change the blood purists' minds, but not all the people who read and believe the Stormer are blood purists. Of course they are, said Brendan incredulously. If they're with the Stormer and its crew, then they believe Muggles are inherently inferior to wizards, which means they're just as bad as the Death Eaters themselves. Brendan, the lot of them can all just be packed up and shipped right off to Azkaban, if you ask me, Brendan finished harshly. It'd save the world a hell of a lot of trouble. Brendan, your father's in it, Katsuji burst out at last. Both Kevin and Brendan froze. Brendan's face went very white. What? He immediately unfolded the paper and started scanning, his green eyes darting madly across the page. Katsuji's face crumpled up in guilt. There's this article about the Guild of Griffins. It's this faction in the Wisengamot that believes that the boundary between the Muggle and Wizarding worlds should be completely torn down, and about how their leader, En Rouge, has been pushing to create a private, all-Muggle army for the express purpose of defending the Ministry from perceived threats. What? Said Kevin, his voice going very wispy and quiet in his shock. Katsuji shook his head, clearly upset as well. I know. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, but people believe it. They even have statements from people at the Wisengamot confirming that En Rouge suggested on the floor of Wisengamot that the ministry should draft Muggle soldiers in our fight against the Death Eaters. And it wasn't just junior members either. There was a bit from Tamsin Appleby's grandmother, and she's been on the bench for 20-plus years. And well, Katsuji faltered as his gaze returned to Brendan. Kevin glanced at Brendan out the corner of his eye. His friend had clearly found the article in question, as his short, round face had become as sickeningly grey as old porridge. Why would he talk to them? He whispered, as his fists clutching the paper shook with rage. Why would he even give that Craft Cuff the time of day when he knows what kind of delusions he dreams up? Kevin reached out a hand and squeezed Brendan's shoulder. There must have been a misunderstanding, maybe. He didn't know who he was talking to. He knew damn well who. Brendan cut him off, his tone rippling with both fury and anguish. En Rouge has always been a dangerous extremist, and this outburst proves it, said senior Wisengamot member Ulysses Halkirk. The Auras may be employees of the Ministry of Magic, but they're part of an independent department. What En Rouge is suggesting involves forcibly drafting Muggles into service, regardless of how much damage it would do to the Statute of Secrecy and how much it would endanger our world. It's despotic, pure and simple. Halkirk also went on to thank the Stormer for reporting on En Rouge's radical views, which the Daily Prophet has been too timid to directly condemn. And ripped the paper in half, his fierce green eyes filling up with tears and his jaw clenching tightly. He looked like he wanted to punch something, so Kevin took a firm but gentle hold of his wrist. Brendan, I'm sorry, Katsuji said quietly. But it's like I said, what the Stormer's printing is suckering in ordinary people as well as monsters. You didn't read the other stuff they're reporting, like you know that word the Slytherins have been using lately. Magic Snatcher, recalled Kevin. Yeah. Apparently it's all because of this old blood theory. Because no one can figure out where Muggle-borns get their magic from. If it isn't from their parents, some pureblood supremacists have gotten it into their heads that Muggle-borns actually steal their magic from young witches and wizards before they can be properly trained. Kevin's mouth fell open. But that's asinine, I know, Katsuji muttered sourly. But it's what they think. They even claim it's the reason why good pureblood families can give birth to squibs or just less magically talented children, because they played with Muggles as children, and those Muggles stole their magic away from them. Brendan tried to slam his fist on the table, but Kevin was able to steady his grip on his wrist enough to stop him. No sane person would believe that, Brendan snarled. You'd think so, said Katsuji patiently, but the problem is how often that lie is written. In just this one paper, the Magic Snatcher theory was referenced as though it were fact over 10 times. After reading it over and over like it's fact, with no one questioning or discussing it anywhere else, I dare say, anyone would start to believe it after a while. And when it's the only paper that publishes certain stories, like the one about Ida Cromwell beating up Burke at the Ministry, well, people could start to rely on it as their best source of information, even if it's flawed. And sooner or later. Well, how much of what the Stormer's writing is the truth? None of it, Brendan shot back furiously. His tear-filled, furious eyes seemed almost mad. None of it is true. I don't believe a word of it. Brendan, Katsuji started weakly, but Brendan didn't want to hear it. Without another word, he stormed away from the Hufflepuff table and out of the hall. Katsuji turned to Kevin helplessly. I don't want them to be right, you know, he said quietly. You know I don't. Kevin nodded mutely. I mean, the thought of tearing down the wall between worlds. Katsuji pressed on. It sounds nice, but I'm sorry, I just think it'd run into a lot of problems. For one, who'd be in charge, the Minister of Magic or the Prime Minister? You'd have to choose one or the other, and there'd be no way to make it fair. Not to mention how much the Muggles would freak out if they learned the truth. Kevin gazed at Katsuji thoughtfully as his friend looked down at the floor, his face turning very despondent. Katsuji knew perhaps better than anyone how badly a Muggle could react to the truth. Katsuji's magical outbursts as a child had been treated as deliberate and belligerent misbehavior by his parents, and so Katsuji was frequently punished for those accidents. When he'd been accepted to Hogwarts, Mr. and Mrs. Yamazaki rejected the invitation, as Katsuji wouldn't be able to go to the Muggle schools they wanted him to and take on the family business as they'd hoped. Fortunately, Professor McGonagall gave them a stern talking to. But even now Katsuji stayed at Hogwarts during every holiday break he could so as to avoid being at home. Biting the inside of his lip, Kevin considered his response carefully. Then at last he reached out, placed a hand on top of Katsuji's on the table, and gave him his best encouraging smile. There might be no simple answer, but fortunately we don't have to figure it all out. All we can really do right now is just support each other the best we can, right? Kevin patted Katsuji's hand once, and then added more brightly, "Now come on, let's get something in our bellies before our next class, okay?" Katsuji smiled slightly in return. Okay. Kevin and Katsuji headed to Transfiguration, hoping to find Brendan there when they arrived. Unfortunately, he seemed to have disappeared. Kevin tried not to look too concerned by his absence. On the way out of the classroom, Kevin and Katsuji were stopped by a voice behind them. "Kevin!" Kevin turned to see Astoria and Arjuna striding up to them. "Hi," he greeted brightly. As soon as the word had left his lips, though, he noticed how much less cheerful Astoria and Arjuna looked. "Kevin, Daphne said something about your friend's father being mentioned in the Stormer," Astoria said urgently. "We know," Kevin cut her off quietly. His face had become much more somber. "We found out at lunch." Astoria's shoulders slackened slightly. She'd clearly been worried about their reactions. "I guess that explains why Halkirk wasn't in class," Arjuna murmured grimly. Katsuji nodded, looking away uncomfortably. As the four set off down the hall together, Arjuna glanced from Katsuji to Kevin, her black eyes narrowing slightly. "Cho's been rather quiet too," she said lowly, "though from what I gather, it's for the opposite reason." "What do you mean?" Kevin asked, his eyebrows furrowing slightly. "Cho's father is friends with some of the people who formed the Guild of Griffins," Arjuna explained. "You know, the group Adrian in Rouge is with. Cho thinks there must have been a misunderstanding, as the Guilders have said they want to bring the worlds together in peace and harmony. But, well, there's just no way to know, is there, if the Prophet won't report it. We asked Professor Burbage about it in class, though, and she had to admit that En Rouge is a little unstable," said Astoria. "She said that En Rouge has always been very interested in Muggle weapons. She thinks he might want to use the Muggle military against the Death Eaters, maybe use some of their more powerful weapons to fight them." Katsuji looked horrified. "You mean like the atomic bomb?" "Yeah, but don't worry, no one in their right mind would support that," Arjuna said quickly. "I mean, it's like Papa says, people worry about their own sphere of the world, and a weapon like that would more than infringe on everyone's spheres just a touch, right?" Kevin's stomach sank. So it's possible the Stormer was telling the truth after all. "It looks like it," Astoria confirmed sadly. Noticing the others' hopeless faces, Arjuna turned to them with new ferocity in her eyes. "What the Stormer said doesn't matter," she said firmly. "None of it does. No matter what tiny shreds of truth might crop up in its articles from time to time, its goal is still the same, to divide us. And even if the Guilders are suggesting this terrible thing, that doesn't make the Stormer and its blood purity nonsense any less awful and untrue." Arjuna's confidence brought the color back to Kevin's cheeks. "Right," he agreed optimistically. "And honestly, who says we have to support the Guilders just because they hate Cuff, or support Cuff just because he hates the Guilders? I think they're both wrong. I'm sure everyone else knows that as well." Kevin had been about to say something else, but just as he strode past a particular hallway, he saw a pair of slightly older wizards confronting each other in the far corner. Thinking it might be a fight, but unsure if they should step in, Kevin abruptly flung his arm out in front of the others, forcing them to back up and hide along the wall so they couldn't be seen. "Kevin," started Astoria, but Kevin quickly turned to her, his pointer finger over his lips in a silencing gesture. "I know Bridget wasn't the only one down there that night," a familiar voice spat, "and I know she's not the sort to buy poisons in Nocturne Alley." "Whatever you're insinuating, Potter, just spit it out," said a drawling voice. "I'm in no mood for games. I know you poisoned Ron Malfoy." Astoria, Arjuna, Katsuji, and Kevin all stared at each other, visibly stricken. Malfoy didn't reply at first. When he did, his voice was so quiet they could barely hear it. "You know that, do you?" There was another long pause. Then Malfoy said, quieter still, "Then why don't you just prove it?" The silence that followed was almost agonizing. It dragged on so long that Astoria couldn't prevent herself from peeking around the corner. Malfoy and Harry were right up in each other's faces. Harry was facing away from Astoria, so Malfoy's pale, pointed face was the more visible of the two, and honestly, the boy who had once been Slytherin's seeker looked positively ill. There were horrible dark bags under his eyes, and his cheeks looked noticeably sallow. His pale complexion was tinted with grey, with no hint of healthy color, and all of the cruel charisma that was so familiar to his features was gone. Astoria thought to herself that she would never have recognized this hollow shell of a boy as the horrid brat who had pushed her into a punch bowl at a ministry Christmas party when she was 8, had Harry not addressed him by his name. Malfoy's grey eyes blazed as they bore into Harry's green ones, but when his mouth twisted upward in something like a smirk, it only served to make his expression look more painful, like a cat that had been hit by a car and was left dying at the side of a road. "You can't, can you?" Malfoy whispered. His smirk fading, he faced Harry with a gaze so full of hate it made him look half mad. "If you had proof, then you would have turned me into Dumbledore, but you don't, because the proof isn't there. I didn't lay a finger on those bottles. Whatever you think you know about me, Potter, you don't know a damn thing." His expression grew colder, number, as he shoved his way past Harry, knocking his shoulder against his as he went. Astoria shrank back and hid herself again, expecting Malfoy to round the corner any second. "An innocent man doesn't stiffen like a stray cat when he gets confronted," Harry said abruptly. The sound of Malfoy's footsteps came to an abrupt halt. An echoing, anxiety-inducing silence once again rippled down the hall. Then, after a long, tense moment, Malfoy strode out of the hall, barreling right past the group of fourth years without even having seen them. As he left, however, Astoria couldn't help but notice how pale and scared his face looked, and for the first time in her life, she found herself wondering if Draco Malfoy, who for as long as she could remember had been nothing but a petty, merciless bully, had more demons than he let on. Chapter 49. The Lemon Juice Spy. Chapter text. Upon learning what the Stormers report contained, the Creevy brothers had made it their personal mission to track down as many copies of it as they could and destroy them. Carlin had been angry and upset enough when Uric Cuff's anti-Muggle-born writings made it into the Daily Prophet, so reading his unfiltered, disgusting opinion and knowing it was becoming more acceptable to people by the day was enough to infuriate him. Dennis's anger had been colder and more intense. From where he stood, Cuff had gone too far when he deliberately targeted Bridget and had now become an active threat to be dealt with. At lunchtime, Carlin and Dennis met at the Gryffindor table to discuss their progress. "I tracked down about 18 copies," said Carlin in irritation. "I was able to burn most of them, though Flitwick came by before I could force Romelda Vane to give me her copy." He neglected to mention how Flitwick's arrival might have also saved him from getting a stinging jinx to the face. "Only got 8 so far, but I overheard one of the Slytherins muttering about where her friend could get a copy," said Dennis with a slight smirk. "I reckon I can just pay a little visit there after herbology and burn the lot." It was sort of funny how, even after all these years, the two boys had hardly changed. Yes, perhaps they'd both gotten a little taller, though Carlin was still barely a head taller than Dennis despite the 2-year age gap. And perhaps Carlin's hair had only gotten blonder, while Dennis's hair had stayed mousy brown. But they still hunched in toward each other and talked quickly and enthusiastically amongst themselves like they were still back in grade school, like it was still just the two of them against the world. Carlin opened up his copy of the Daily Prophet and continued reading. "Ah, they put an apostrophe in it, when it's supposed to be possessive," he scoffed. "Dennis, give me your quill, will you?" Having noticed the sourness in Carlin's face before he'd even spoken, Dennis had taken out the quill in anticipation of the request, and so Carlin could immediately get to work scribbling his corrections. Most people would likely have told Carlin that good grammar was less important than the sentiment behind the articles, but Dennis knew his brother well enough to never suggest that. "Anything decent today?" Dennis asked lightly. Carlin looked up. "Well, Goodfellow stuff's good, as always. He put in a short piece about Scrimgeour's newest security measures for the ministry, and even though he had to flatter him, he was still able to get across how extreme they are, said that Scrimgeour's measures could give the Gringotts goblins a run for their money." Dennis snorted in amusement. "Well, I suppose that old Pratt Scrimgeour looks a touch like a goblin already." The owls had started flapping overhead. A good flock of them headed over toward the Slytherin table, and Colin watched them drop a stack of letters off in front of Bridget. His dark eyes narrowed. "Bridget's got more post," he muttered. Dennis glanced over his shoulder at the Slytherin table, his face turning more solemn. "More hate mail in response to the Stormer's bunk, you think?" "Yeah," Colin said crossly. His cheeks started to flush angrily. "It's just disgusting, the sort of stuff they've been saying, claiming she was trying to take revenge for Ron having beaten her, that she stole magic from some really talented pureblood as a kid in order to get here. Apparently the Slytherins have even been trying to force her not to sit at their table, because they don't want anything to do with her. It's right rotten," agreed Dennis vehemently, his righteous anger making his tone quieter in contrast to his brother, whose volume tended to increase when he was mad. "Do you reckon we could convince Dumbledore to let her room with us Gryffindors for a while? Could protect her from all of this mess?" "I doubt it," Colin said begrudgingly. "Even if Dumbledore said yes, I doubt Bridget would, too proud to run away. I'd say, 'S'pose we can't blame her for that, eh?" It was as the two brothers talked amongst themselves that an owl flopped down between them and dropped a letter onto Dennis's plate. The younger Creevy picked it up. It was in a distinctive mint green envelope, addressed in emerald green ink, though the address was cut off in the corner with an intrusive purple ops stamp, confirming that it had been examined and approved by the Ministry of Magic's new Owl Post Security Board. Colin and Dennis Creevy Gryffindor House Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Dennis immediately ripped it open. It was a card with the words, "Thank you," enchanted to dance across the front in big, overly excitable blue and red letters. When he opened it, a strange lemony smell that reminded him of cleaning supplies touched his nose, and he found a little note on the inside. "Thanks for helping out with my article. I couldn't write the amazing things I do without you. Terence Higgs Goodfellow, it's from Goodfellow," said Dennis, thanking us for our input for his Magic report. Colin raised his eyebrows. "Well, that's nice of him, I suppose." He glanced around. A few other mint green envelopes had been deposited around the tables to other students: Arjuna, Cho, Eddie Carmichael, Susan Bones, Harry, and Hermione. "Guess he sent a couple of M, though I noticed Pansy Parkinson and Hector Summerby didn't get one," Colin said smugly. "Didn't like their sentiments, I suppose." Dennis's dark eyes ran over the card thoughtfully. "Colin," he said slowly, "can you give me some water? Conjure it up with your wand." Faintly surprised, Colin did as his brother requested, tapping Dennis's goblet with his wand and filling it with water with the charm Aquamenti. Dennis then dipped his fingers in it and started brushing them against the card. Colin's eyes lit up. "Do you think there's a secret message?" he asked in a hushed, excited voice. "Well, remember, I brought up how we used to use invisible ink," Dennis whispered back eagerly. "How he should write the articles he wants inside the Daily Prophet with it, so we can read what's really going on. Maybe he ran with the idea." As Dennis trailed his wet fingers along the card, however, nothing appeared. Undeterred, Colin plunged his hand into his school bag and fetched out his bright red revealer eraser. Here, maybe he used an enchantment instead. He is wizard-born, after all. He started frantically rubbing the edge of the revealer up against both sides of the card. Alas, like before, nothing happened. Both Creevy brothers looked disappointed. "Guess it was too much to hope for," Colin said gloomily. Dennis, however, could not quite let go of his original theory. Something didn't add up about the cards. Sure, perhaps Goodfellow had only sent them to the people he'd actually liked talking to as opposed to everyone he'd interviewed. But why would he put in so much work just to send them such impersonal, crisp little notes? So Dennis held onto the card, resolving to do more tests later as he headed off for herbology. The other third-year Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs were already there by the time he arrived. He stopped outside the door of Greenhouse 3, just behind Owen and his friend Elena Bradstone. "Hi, Dennis," Owen greeted pleasantly. "Hey, Owen," answered Dennis. The two had never been friends per se, but Owen was amiable enough of a person that Dennis didn't mind the familiarity. Unlike Dennis, Owen was the sort of person who could make friends easily. Perhaps it was the laid-back, good-natured air he let off, or perhaps it was just his comfort dealing with both Muggle and wizard technology, thanks to his mixed ancestry. But he'd always been able to get along with a wide array of people. whether purebloods like Hector Summerby or muggle-borns like Elena. It made Dennis feel a bit jealous, considering that the Creevy brothers had never had as easy of a time of making friends, but Dennis just couldn't make himself dislike Owen. The Hufflepuff's amiability just rubbed off too much on him for Dennis to really resent him. Elena smiled at Dennis, and he avoided her eyes with a faint blush. She had always been quite pretty. She'd started wearing her black hair in a cute pixie cut that year, but it only served to better frame her pale face and small black eyes. Plus, she was about the only thing that kept Dennis awake in history of magic. She was the only student who ever raised her hand to ask questions in that class. Owen noted the mint-green envelope still clutched in Dennis's hand and smiled slightly. "Goodfellow wrote to you too, huh?" he asked. Dennis blinked. "You got one?" "Yeah," he asked some questions about Hannah for the article. "It was nice of him to send cards, wasn't it? Don't reckon that Bat Rita Skeeter ever did that for any of her sources." "Yeah," Dennis replied, though he couldn't help but let his tone drift off into nothingness as he once again considered Goodfellow's sparse note. Professor Sprout arrived at that moment, looking chipper as she shuffled past her students to unlock the door and let them in. Dennis settled down in the back row as always. Owen and Elena took a station just to the left of him. Sprout started her lecture about pufferpards, but Dennis couldn't help but let his attention drift away. He covertly snuck the card back out of its envelope and peeked at it again under the table. The Hogwarts post was being monitored. Dennis knew that full well. Just the other day, he'd overheard Professors McGonagall and Snape talking about how half of Bridget's mail had been destroyed since they had come full of nasty hexes, poisons, and non-ministry-approved insults. The Arps had even started destroying packages that came with any personalized enchantments, unless they were performed and verified by a sanctioned vendor like Zonko's, in an attempt to deter the flood of jinxed notes and poisoned gifts. Why go through all of that potential scrutiny just to be polite? And besides, Goodfellow had been in Slytherin. He'd been very amiable, but he was still a Slytherin. And didn't Slytherins idolize cleverness? So it wouldn't be out of character for him to try to sneakily subvert the Owl Post Security Board's strict rules, right? It's weird, isn't it? Dennis jumped, looking up quickly. Owen was facing the board, pretending to pay attention to Sprout's lecture, but he continued to talk under his breath just loud enough for Dennis to hear him. The note was so short. Goodfellow doesn't seem like the kind of guy to be that brief, you know. Dennis felt an exhilarating wave of validation wash over him. "I know," he muttered back. "I mean, he and Colin and we were talking for almost 20 minutes about lots of stuff." Owen nodded. "I thought maybe he was using some sort of code, you know, to try to duck the Arps," he whispered, his voice quite a bit slower than Dennis's frenetic cadence. "I got a badge for breaking codes in Hippogriff Scouts, and I thought Goodfellow would probably be sharp enough to try it. But I couldn't find anything. I mean, even in codes, you need a bit more to work with." "I was thinking that it could be invisible ink," Dennis cut him off. "Colin and I were telling him about it. When he visited, we used to use it a lot as kids, you see, send notes to each other that no one else could read and splash a bit of water on them to make the ink appear. Only, we tried both water and a revealer, and they didn't work." Elena's small black eyes lit up. "Owen," she whispered excitedly, "the lemon smell on the card. I bet Goodfellow used lemon juice." Both Owen and Dennis looked confused. "Lemon juice, like the German lemon juice spies, you know," Elena prompted. "Afraid not, Elle," Owen said amusedly. "We're not history buffs like you, remember." Elena looked faintly impatient, but she kept the emotion in her voice and eyes very muted. She was not the sort to get overly animated. It made her look almost deadpan. During World War I, the British Army, the Muggle one, I mean, had been censoring a lot of mail, she explained lowly. "I have a couple of books about the war at home. There were these German spies who'd been hiding out here and used this old formula for invisible ink that used lemon juice for their messages. It was so basic that the British Secret Service caught them right fast and sent them to the tower for it. But I bet most wizards wouldn't know about it. All you have to do is put a letter marked with lemon juice over a flame, and you'll reveal the message." Dennis's entire face lit up. "Brilliant." Owen was smiling broadly too. "Dennis, let's meet after class, then we can test it." Once herbology was over, the three broke away from their respective housemates and headed off together toward the lake. Once they'd settled themselves under a large tree, they peeked around for any possible observers, and once they determined the coast was clear, Dennis took out the card and his wand. Incendio. Unfortunately, his fire-summoning spell was too powerful. In an instant, the card had caught fire. Dennis dropped it with a yelp, but fortunately it had been completely burnt to cinders by the time it reached the ground. "Good thing we have a backup," said Owen calmly, smiling slightly. "Let me try this time. I think I can manage it." Dennis nodded sheepishly. Owen had always been better at charms than he had. Owen took out his own lemon-scented card, holding his wand significantly farther away from the back of the card than Dennis had. Incendio. His wand burst into a much more controlled flame. Very carefully, he ran the flame-touched wand back and forth over the back of the card. "Something's appearing," he said excitedly. Dennis and Alina peeked over his shoulder. "Guy Guild," Dennis read each word slowly as it appeared. "Accusations true. Ministry. Shadowing Guilders. Ups Titans on Ministry. Hogwarts de Diagon and Mungo's." Owen gave a visible start. "St. Mungo's." "I didn't know they were regulating St. Mungo's mail too." Alina immediately looked concerned. "Owen, the package you sent." Owen glanced at Dennis, his face more overtly worried than Alina's. "I sent Ron my own box of handmade fizzing Whizbees a few days ago. I thought they might cheer him up. The Ops has been destroying all packages with hand-done enchantments," Dennis recalled, visibly upset. "So Ron wouldn't have gotten your present. And if any of Ron's other friends sent anything with personalized magic on it, he probably wouldn't have gotten those either," said Alina sadly. Owen's eyes narrowed slightly, becoming much more serious as he handed his copy of Goodfellow's card to Dennis. "Tell your brother to meet the rest of the cooking club down in the kitchens tonight," he said. "I'll talk to the others. We need to come up with something if we want Ron to get everything we send him." Dennis nodded firmly. "I'll tell Harry, Hermione, and Ginny too. They ought to know." That evening after dinner, Colin came down to the kitchens, Goodfellow's card in hand. As he approached the portrait, he came across Cho. "Hey, Cho," he said, trying to smile despite the anxiety he felt. Cho attempted a weak smile in return. "Hi, Colin." She seemed a little paler than usual. Colin had heard something about Cho's father and the guild, and had a feeling he knew why. "Is your father okay?" he asked. I know the mail's watched and he probably can't say much, but he didn't really know how to finish, so his sentence stagnated. Cho seemed to appreciate the sympathy, though. "Yes, he's all right," she said softly. "I got a letter from him this morning. He didn't say anything about the guild, probably couldn't, but he seemed chipper enough." Despite this, her black eyes still drifted off toward the ground. Colin impulsively reached a hand out and patted her arm reassuringly. "I'm sure he'll be okay," he told her kindly, his tone once again just as fast as his brain was moving. "You're awful smart, so I'm sure he is too, and let's be honest, the ministry seems to have a shortage of brains. Last year a bunch of fifth-year students bust into Department of Mysteries all on their own, right? My father and mother work for the ministry," Cho said amusedly. Colin opened his mouth to awkwardly apologize, but Cho stopped him. "Thank you," she said, her lips touched with a soft, sincere smile. They approached the portrait of the fruit bowl. Cho extended a hand, tickled the pair, and the portrait swung open, allowing them entrance. When they entered the kitchens, they found most of the others waiting for them. Hannah, Millicent, Astoria, Arjuna, Kevin, Bridget, Owen, and Rose had all settled themselves around the kitchen, though unlike usual none of them had taken out any cooking supplies. "Cho, Colin," said Hannah. Walked right up to them, putting a hand on each of their shoulders and squeezing. "Glad you could make it." Colin glanced around to the others, his anxiety on his face. "So you all heard about Goodfellow's message?" "I told them," said Owen, nodding. "I guess it makes sense that if they tightened security here, they'd also do it at St. Mungo's," said Arjuna sensibly, though she didn't seem particularly pleased. It's tightened here because of Ron getting poisoned, and now Ron's over there." Bridget scowled. "Even if the idea made any sense, the security itself is nonsense. My gift didn't have magic in it, but that post belongs to its recipient, no one else. Ron deserves his privacy, all of us do." Cho nodded. "I understand the desire to protect people. I've heard that a lot of dangerous packages have gotten filtered out by the Ops before they could reach the school, so there have been some benefits, but they're clearly throwing out the good along with the bad." The last member of the group, Daphne, finally arrived. She had two large leather-bound books under her arm, one orange and one white. "Evening, everyone," she greeted the others coolly. Surprisingly, her face was not the least bit concerned. Instead, her lips were curled up in the faintest of satisfied, refined smirks. "As luck would have it," Daphne said breezily, "I have a solution." Chapter 50, Daphne's Gift. Chapter text. Ron received several more packages, cards, and letters over the course of the week. A few of them, like Colin's and Cho's, bore the distinctive old sock-like smell that indicated they'd been copied. But some of them, like Rose's and Seamus's, were innocent enough that they got through unscathed. Ginny, Harry, and Hermione's birthday presents had also arrived. Sadly, Ron wouldn't be able to use his new Quidditch gloves until he got back to Hogwarts, but his mother helped him put on his new bright orange Chudley Cannon's scarf, and Jengu had been kind enough to help him look over some of the new recipes in the huge cookbook Hermione had sent. Some food dishes also made it through safely. Hannah had sent Ron a delicious blackberry pie, while Arjuna had sent a package of deep-fried, crispy snacks stuffed with minced meat that she called Luckmies. Mrs. Weasley even tried one and was thoroughly charmed by it. The present that made Ron happiest, though, was a bouquet of white flowers with a letter tucked inside. "Dear Ron, I know a lot of the others are baking things for you, but under the circumstances, I knew I had to send you these instead. Once a girl from my ballet class got in a car accident, and she and her dad both ended up in the hospital with broken limbs. My mum took me to the flower shop, and we picked out the biggest, prettiest bouquets of chrysanthemums we could find to put next to their beds to cheer up their hospital rooms. Mum always sends chrysanthemums whenever any of her friends are going through something difficult. She says they mean optimism. When you first got poisoned, it felt like I was in an awful nightmare. I couldn't have been more relieved when I learned you were going to be all right. I know you're still going to be in the hospital for a while, but the fact that you're alive is enough for me, at least for now. Still, I'm sure it sucks being in there, so I hope this helps. Thank you for believing me. So many people don't, but the fact that you're not one of them comforts me more than anything else. Thank you for your friendship, and I hope you can send a letter back soon, even if you can't write it yourself. Love." Bridget. The bouquet now sat on his bedside table next to the get well cards from Neville, Lavender, Millicent, Dennis, Dean, Seamus, Luna, Kevin, Astoria, and Cho. Thanks to the healing potions he'd taken over the last week, he could now shift himself in bed enough to look at them, even though he didn't have the dexterity needed to pick any of them up yet, and that had helped. As the week came to a close, there was a change in Jengu. He suddenly seemed distracted and worried, and he kept looking over his shoulder and forgetting the schedule for Ran's healing potions. When Ran had tried asking him about it, Jengu had been evasive. "It's nothing for you to worry about, Ran," he said, with a slightly strained smile. "All you need to worry about right now is getting better, not my personal problems." The ministry had been placing tighter security around the wards as of late. According to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, there was now an aura who monitored the halls, speedily observing all of the guests and staff members as they migrated around St. Mungo's. Apparently, the aura department had even originally wanted to allow their agents to patrol the medical wards at night, but the chief healer, Augusta Feverfew, had put her foot down and ordered them to leave the patients be. Maybe that aura is what's got Jengu spooked, Ron thought. I'm sure anybody would be a little unsettled by that kind of scrutiny. That weekend, Harry, Hermione, and Ginny used the Flu Network to come for a visit. When they entered, Hermione was carrying a weird orange book under her arm. "What you reading, Hermione?" Ron asked casually. "Oh, just one of my old favorites," Hermione answered pleasantly. She glanced over her shoulder cautiously. The rest of the ward had emptied out over the last week, but there were a handful of healers just outside the open door to the ward. Ginny, successfully feigning casualness, sidled over to the door and closed it. "Muffliato," Harry whispered, pointing his wand at the door. Ron raised an eyebrow at the three curiously. Harry grinned. "We just don't want anyone to overhear," he said lowly. "We promised to make sure no one could potentially eavesdrop on us by noon. At least the ward's empty, which makes it easier. We thought we might have to set off a decoy detonator." "Why?" asked Ron with a frown. "Promise to. We'll explain later," said Hermione, her face turning more concerned as she asked, "How are you feeling?" Ron gave a weak shrug. Better, I suppose, still can hardly move, but at least I can sit up and such. Wish I could scratch my nose when I want to, though. How's the team looking? Cormac's passable, Harry said half-heartedly. He's a complete twat, scoffed Ginny. He's a decent enough player, Harry explained, but his attitude is pretty shoddy. He kept puffing himself up and flirting with Demelzer and me the entire practice, said Ginny scornfully. I wanted to cast a bat bogey hex on him, but fortunately he got hit in the face with a bludger, so I didn't have to. Harry couldn't quite keep the smile off his face at the memory either. Believe me, we'll all be really glad to have you back. Ron smiled. I'll be glad to be back too. Out the corner of his eye, he noticed Jengu walk past the window, glancing over his shoulder nervously. Ron frowned. Hey, did you guys see that aura on the way in? Asked Ron. That big ugly one with the humorless face, Ginny said darkly. Yeah, looked like a human vulture, kept sweeping around, glaring at everyone suspiciously. He was like Filch except worse, agreed Harry. As we went through security, it felt like he was trying to smell misbehavior on our shoulders. He was so close. I reckon he's there because of the Guild of Griffins, whispered Hermione. The what? Said Ron. Hermione, and Ginny quickly explained what they knew, including the secret message Goodfellow had sneaked in. So now apparently the Ministry's tailing any and all members, said Hermione. I'll bet they're trying to find other members too, ones they don't know about. Ron's stomach squirmed. Jengu had expressed sympathies for Enrouge's position that one time, but he'd never said anything about wanting to form a private Muggle army to fight the Death Eaters. Jengu didn't seem like the type to go along with something so stupid. Was it a misunderstanding? Was Jengu not really a member of the group, but had just liked some of their ideas? Harry's green eyes narrowed slightly. It's ridiculous. Sure, maybe Enrouge suggested something stupid, but the Death Eaters are killing people. That's what the Ministry should be worrying about, not trying to hunt down these Guilders. Harry, Ginny stopped him abruptly. She nodded to the clock. It was almost noon. Check the door, Harry told her. Ginny darted over to the other side of the doorway, covertly watching for anyone outside who might try to enter. It's clear. Ron looked from Harry to Ginny, confused. What? Hermione took his hand. Ron couldn't feel any sort of warmth from the action, but at least he could vaguely sense she was holding it this time. We'll explain in a minute, she murmured gently. The clock counted down to noon, 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, crack. A familiar house elf abruptly appeared in the center of the ward floor, dressed in his most obnoxious maroon-colored socks and a new red hat, and carrying an orange book identical in appearance to the one Hermione was carrying. Darby, Ron choked in surprise. Master Weasley, Darby said brightly. So good to see you. The little elf thrust both of his tiny arms around Ron's legs under the sheets, squeezing them tight in his best attempt at a hug. Ron grinned. Good to see you too, Darby, but what? In a minute, Hermione reiterated softly. She passed Darby the orange book she'd been holding, and Darby gave her his identical copy in return. Then, with a little bounce, the house elf leapt back down to the floor. Get well soon, Master Weasley, said Darby, waving a long-fingered hand in a cheerful goodbye. With that, he disappeared with another crack. Ginny left her place by the door, grinning from ear to ear as she returned to Ron's bedside. Go ahead and open the book, Ron, she said eagerly. Hermione placed the orange leather book in his lap. Ron, biting his lip, put his hand awkwardly on the cover, flapping it around until he could slide his digits under the orange leather and slap the book open. The name Ronald Bilious Weasley was written into the interior cover, and on the first page was a letter written in flawlessly beautiful penmanship. Dear Ron, this is a handcrafted Cransomere scrapbook. Like a two-way mirror, it allows two people to talk back and forth with each other, only through the written word instead of face-to-face. Anything written, drawn, pasted, or taped into either scrapbook will instantly appear in the other. It also includes the additional privacy measure that only the owner, S, whose full name is written into the cover, can open and read its contents. Once it's closed, if anyone else opens it, all they will see are some generic pictures Carlin has taped in for you. As of yet, this kind of scrapbook is not on the market, as its creator is still saving up for his own workshop back in Bulgaria, so no one else will have one or know how it works. He's working on prototypes for more advanced models that would allow multiple people to contact each other through them. But for now, I suppose this will do. Our copy will stay in the kitchens, so that any member of the cooking club can access it. Still, for security, we'll have to keep the book's existence purely on a need-to-know basis. So I'm afraid I'm just keeping your sister, Potter, and Granger in the fold. Even though I'm sure you won't be able to write back yet, I expect receiving letters and pictures will still be of some comfort. Be strong. You will get through this, and until you do, imagine the great triumph you'll feel upon your return to Hogwarts. Love from Daphne. Ron looked up at the others, stunned. Wait, so anything you write in this will appear immediately and be completely private, finished Ginny in satisfaction. We brought a fake copy filled with Colin's pictures with us so that everyone would see the book arrive. So the healers won't ask where you got it and get suspicious. As far as anyone else will know, it'll just be a cute little scrapbook without any magic in it whatsoever. Hermione squeezed Ron's hand, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Go on, turn the page. Ron once again slipped his clumsily stiff hand under the page with some difficulty and flipped it over. The page was filled with shorter postscripts. We miss you so much, Ron. It'll be so much fun to have you in the kitchens again. Love, Hannah, you can do it, Ron. We believe in you. Kevin, stay strong, Ron. If anyone can get through this, it's you. Astoria Penguins. Sorry, I wanted to make you laugh. Hope it worked. Zaxaxo Rose, see you soon. Weasley. Millicent B, I know being stuck in bed is no fun at all, but this should hopefully brighten up your days some. Get well soon. Owen, get well soon, Ron. I promise I'll tape in a new picture every single day until you get back. Cheers. Colin. Ron, I can't imagine the discomfort and pain you're going through. I've only ever been to St. Mungo's once after accidentally setting my room on fire when I was little, and the experience at St. Mungo's was easily the worst part, as it was the first and only time I've ever seen my father cry. It's such a barren, unhappy place, which couldn't be a worse prison for such a generous and cheerful person as you. But if there's one thing I learned while watching you in the Magic competition, it is that no chains can hold you, however strong and heavy they might be. Fight on, Ron, and don't give up. One can only really fail when one stops trying. Arjuna, everyone said it all already, so here's a quick drawing for you. Hope you like it, and hang in there. Love, Cho. Ron, hope the flowers reached you, but in case they didn't, let me just say thank you for believing in me. I hope you know how much that means to me, and I hope you know how much your friendship means, too. There's this old saying about how you're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. If you were a quote, Ron, you'd definitely be that one. Thank you. Bridget Cho's note was embellished with a small sketch depicting a grinning Ron with a cute little crown on his head and a pair of tiny dragon wings sprouting out of his back. By the time Ron had finished reading all the notes, he felt his eyes filling up with tears, though he quickly forced them back. Hermione, Harry, and Ginny all smiled as they watched him reread the notes several times. Harry came over to Ron's other side, sat down on the bed, and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. Then, to everyone's surprise, as they sat there together, they noticed words starting to appear little by little on the open opposite page. Hi, Ron. Just got the fake book back. I can't believe that Daphne's idea really worked. Not that she isn't brilliant, but you know. I'm enclosing an editorial that appeared in the Prophet this morning. As soon as I read it, I knew you, and the others just had to see it. We'll write back more later. Colin, a few moments later, several Daily Prophet clippings pasted together so that the letter could be read seamlessly appeared underneath the note. To the readers of the Daily Prophet, I have both written and spoken publicly many times in the past as a politician, as a resource, and as an enthusiastic author. But today, I write to all of you solely as a citizen of the wizarding world and as a grandmother of two sweet little boys. For the last 30 years, I have watched the wizarding world evolve in ways I could never have imagined possible. When I was a little girl, my parents were captivated by news of Grindelwald's reign of terror raging throughout Eastern Europe. I remember how they would spout off the numbers of Muggle casualties and how much the numbers would blur. In the span of one day it'd be 50, then 35, and then 65, and even then it was all still just guesswork. Even now, most numbers in the assembled lists of Grindelwald's Muggle casualties are estimations more than anything else, mostly because, back then, it was seen as more important to help wizards identify their deceased family members, as Muggles couldn't be told the real rationale behind their relatives' demise. I remember as a child being forbidden to play at the local playground because so many Muggle children liked to go there. Though my brother and I still used to sneak out from time to time under our parents' noses, it was always a lot of fun, even when some of the Muggle children would taunt us for our funny clothes. I learned how to play jacks on that playground, and Maximus got to play with a cap gun, which was a toy version of a real Muggle weapon that shoots pieces of metal into people's bodies. But even the Muggles knew things were dangerous back then. We'd have to all run inside whenever the sirens went off, though our Muggle friends would have to go underground into these secret bunkers, while Maximus and I simply got to run back home. Since our house was unplottable and protected with magical shields, the bombs didn't have as much effect on us as it did on our neighbors. My father served as one of the minister's aides at the time and often had to travel abroad to Bulgaria and Romania for work, and I remember Mother waiting up every night to make sure he arrived home on time after every single trip. Even long after Grindelwald fell, Mother would still never be able to sleep until Father arrived home. By the time I attended Hogwarts, Grindelwald had been defeated, and with it, small changes started to creep in. Minister Spencermoon hired a few new employees from Muggle families in different departments. The term Muggleborn was used more actively, as the previous, more disgusting term reminded people too much of Grindelwald's horrors. Muggle studies became an optional class in my second year, and I was one of the first students to take it the following year. It was fascinating, delving into the trinkets and baubles of the Muggle world and amusedly observing their interesting non-magical takes on our own magical innovations. Things like baseball bats and typewriters were charming novelties that made for great essay subjects. I was quite proud to receive an O on both my OWL and Newt for Muggle studies, as I knew knowledge of Muggles and their culture would more than serve me well at the Ministry of Magic. Given the subject of this letter and the lengths to which my career has already been discussed by scholars and critics alike, I will not discuss my time at the Ministry in great detail. What I will discuss, however, are the feelings that lengthy career brought out in me, the horror, the anger, and more than any other, the grief. The day before I was to start my new job as junior undersecretary to the minister in 1975, my best friend from Hogwarts, Georgette Fawcett, had been admitted to St. Mungo's after having been mauled by werewolf Death Eater Fenrir Greyback. The next morning, I got the news that she had passed away from her injuries. In 1976, I personally witnessed two of my co-workers die when a death's head shell exploded near our Superior Minister Mincham's podium. In 1979, my brother Maximus was possessed via the Imperious Curse, and under the direction of the Death Eaters, killed 3 members of the Order of the Phoenix before being killed by Sirius Black in self-defense. My father was killed in an attack near King's Cross Station in 1980, and in the years following his death, Mother would still wander the house, delirious and unable to sleep, because she was waiting for Father and Maximus to come home. The war had a steep cost for my family, and it's taken a long time to rebuild from that. There were times, while I was in office, that my grief and anger likely affected my decisions, and because of that, there are people who I know I have wronged, and because many of them are no longer alive, I now have no chance to make up for the errors I made. Despite those mistakes, however, I deluded myself into thinking that I could simply move forward, away from them, and over the course of the next 10 years, it felt like the wizarding world had as well. Wizards started taking cues from Muggle clothing trends, wearing leather jackets and jeans. Muggle foods like pizza started popping up in wizard-owned restaurants. The registries of ministry employees had more Muggle names than ever before, and for the first time in my memory, a band with a prominent Muggle-born member, the Weird Sisters, become the most popular wizard musicians in Great Britain. Over time, we've become comfortable with these little nuggets of Muggle influence cropping up in pop culture and even occasionally in our day-to-day lives. But as of late, the world has become a much scarier place, and in this atmosphere of fear, a bizarre hatred and distrust of Muggles and Muggle-born witches and wizards has seemingly sprouted up from nowhere, growing like parasitic weeds in our hearts and minds. This war between the Death Eaters and the rest of the wizarding world has devolved, with the rest of our world being destroyed from within by a vicious civil war of blood politics. Where we once saw two different cultural backgrounds, we now see inferior and superior races. Suddenly, we look at a 14-year-old muggle-born witch who befriended all of the classmates working beside her and earned my respect for her brilliance and talent, and see a fanged beast wishing to feed off of the magic of our precious pureblood children. And all of this started not from the Death Eaters, but I now realize from us. I am a mother of 3 and a grandmother of 2. I grew up in a wizarding family with roots as far back as the 17th century, and although I have friends who came from Muggle families and got top grades in Muggle studies while at school, I myself have little to no personal experience in the Muggle world. Over the course of many years, I subconsciously started to see Muggles as separate from us, not just physically, but also emotionally. It was never a malicious thing, but there was still a boundary there, as if I were still looking down at them from my window like when I was a child. Even when I studied them, my teachers would put quotes around Muggle phrases and compare their inventions frequently, and often unfavorably, to our magical counterparts. The Muggles' funny traditions and quirks charmed me the way a puppy rolling over on its back can. And it was through my classes and society's subconscious lessons that I had been coaxed into a thought process that deemed Muggles as fragile, pitiable, almost lesser creatures. But through reflection, and through the counsel of good friends like Albus Dumbledore and Gordon Ramsay, I've learned that despite their lack of magical talent, they are in no need of help from the wizarding world. They are resourceful enough and strong enough and smart enough to create their own world without the use of magic, one that allows them to live, work, play, and create on their own terms. They are feeling, free human beings with hearts and minds as brilliant as our own. They have their own wars to fight and their own demons to slay, and so they should neither be persecuted as inferior nor forcibly coaxed into fighting for our causes. They deserve to live their lives and deal with their own problems, while we deal with ours. This surge in anti-Muggle sentiment does not come solely from hatred, but also from our society at large. We still, by and large, will judge someone favorably simply because of their family name. We still will hire someone from an established wizard family over someone from a Muggle one. We still feel a touch of surprise whenever we encounter a Muggle-born who shows impressive talent at magic, while expecting nothing less from a so-called pureblood. And this all comes back to the way our magical society operates today. Because more people from magical families climb the ladder of power, we associate them with it. And because Muggle-borns often have to shed everything of who they were due to the statute of secrecy, we judge them for not having a wide circle of associates that we can refer to for recommendations. Because so many magical families have been able to build up solid reputations over the course of many years, we look down on those who have no such legacy, even though so many of the great oak trees that are those great magical families, likewise, started as a tiny, promising acorn of a witch or wizard. Because we see our own pain and struggles, we refuse to acknowledge those of others, and refuse to consider how some of the gifts we've been given were at the expense of those others. Because we put in so much work to get ahead in today's world, we disregard the fact that we may not have earned our rewards solely through that work, but also because of the esteem in our family name. Because we do not take the time to acknowledge how many more roadblocks are put in the way of Muggle-borns, the lack of magical support from their families, the difference in cultural background, the discrimination, we treat any shortcomings they express as evidence of lesser magic, rather than the result of many extraneous favors. Things that are old and established can feel familiar and comforting, but they can also give way to complacency and stagnation. And as valuable as tradition is, it should never be at the cost of progress. I do believe our world is just, and that these ideas of blood superiority will fade away, as they did when Grindelwald was defeated and he who must not be named fell the first time. But it shall be up to us how many more people die before that happens. I lost so many loved ones in the First Wizarding War, and I hope beyond hope that this new generation of promising young witches and wizards, as well as my grandchildren's generation, will not undergo the pain and grief that I had to. And so I challenge Uric Cuff, Adrian in Rouge, and everyone else in between to look inward at yourselves. Acknowledge the cruelties and weaknesses in your heart that force you to solely see yourselves and your needs at the expense of the rest of the world. Realize how much doom that line of thinking will bring both to you and others, and most of all, make a change. Once long ago, I fought for the wizarding world's right to party. Starting today, I shall take on a new fight to destroy the evil not just in others, but also in myself, and I pray that the rest of the wizarding world shall do the same. Millicent Bagnold, Minister of Magic, 1980-1990.